famine, the brainwashing of your friends, family, and children, unreasonable laws that can land you and everyone you love in a labor camp, or worse, publicly executed for infractions as minor as listening to foreign music. It simply is too much for some North Koreans to bear. Desperate to escape, a select few take their lives into their own hands, risking it all to escape Kim Jong-un's grasp so they can start new lives in other countries. But unfortunately, the numbers that make it out alive have been falling since 2005. According to Statista, 1,384 North Koreans managed to defect in that year. The numbers generally increased from there, reaching a peak of 2,914 in 2009. Then, it all started to go downhill. For the next 10 years, the number of people who successfully escaped kept declining, with 2019 seeing the lowest number of defectors since 2005, just 1,047 people. Then the pandemic hit, and with it, North Korea panicked to the point where it closed its borders completely, even shutting down trade into the country. Just 229 people escaped in 2020, with 2021 seeing only 63 people make it away from North Korea. The following year wasn't much better, just 67 escaped in 2022, but Statista says that in 2023, it was an uptick. Up to September 2023, 319 North Koreans had successfully fled. We don't know all of their stories. Many have escaped and then disappeared into new lives in the hope that Kim Jong-un will never find them. However, a select few have stories to share that reveal how the only people to escape North Korea managed to flee in 2023. It all starts with a man named Mr. Kim. At the beginning of 2023, he pulled off a daring escape, fleeing North Korea by sea along with his mother, his brother's family, and his heavily pregnant wife. In an interview with the BBC, Mr. Kim, accompanied by a plainclothes police officer, recounted his story. There's been a lot of suffering, he said as he explained how North Korea responded to the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Kim says that life in North Korea became even harder once the pandemic hit, with the state broadcasting images of people dying from the virus all over the world, while instituting hard rules about what North Koreans had to do to avoid death themselves. Propaganda ramped up. Kim and his country people were told that failing to follow the new pandemic rules would lead to all of North Korea being wiped out. Whenever a case of COVID-19 was suspected, armed guards would arrive to quarantine an entire town or village. The people left inside couldn't get out, meaning they had no access to food outside of what was already in the town when it went into lockdown. Kim says that North Korean forces used these quarantines to exert their control. After locking down a town for several days, starving its people in the process, the government would arrive with trucks to deliver food supplies. They claimed to be selling that food cheaply, but the reality was that the state was using the pandemic to break people's spirits. Kim says they made these claims to receive praise, quote, like starving your baby, then giving them a small amount so it would thank you. Questions started to arise in Kim's mind. He began to question the state, believing that it was using the pandemic to make a profit rather than instituting quarantines to help North Korea's people. And as more people he knew caught and survived COVID-19, he began to question whether the state had exaggerated the dangers. He started to believe that North Korea's harsh lockdowns, which involved closing its own borders, were simply an excuse to suppress people. Worse yet, he began to hear about people starving. By closing its borders, North Korea had shut out food supplies from other countries. Food prices skyrocketed, and families were left with very little to eat. As Kim said, you'd wake up one morning and hear, "Oh, someone in this district starved to death." Those reports kept rolling in, with Kim pointing out that even North Korea's farmers were not immune from dwindling food supplies. The state would force those with a poor harvest to deliver their own food, leaving them with precious little to eat. Perhaps it's for these reasons that North Korea applied to the World Food Program for help in March 2023. Regardless, Kim managed to survive in these difficult conditions for years. He set himself up as a grasshopper seller, a peddler of black market goods, making enough money to afford stew for his family. As Kim pointed out, that counts as eating very well in North Korea. Still, Kim was far from comfortable. Being a black market seller in North Korea means that people are constantly willing to report you for your activities. After all, by reporting Kim, another North Korean could get their hands on some much-needed food or financial aid. Kim says that he often had to make quick escapes when he sensed that state authorities were on their way, packing up his merchandise and going into hiding before resuming his illicit career the next day. He says that he fantasized about escaping hundreds of times before he actually made his attempt, but it was the tragic death of one of his friends that forced him over the edge. That friend wanted something simple to achieve in most other countries, a divorce from his wife. But the state told him that divorce wasn't possible unless he submitted to being sent to a labor camp. Kim's friend was devastated, He accumulated more and more debt trying to find a way out of his marriage until it all became too much. Kim's friend took his own life. He says that a visit to that friend's bedroom was one of his sparks that ignited his escape plan. According to Kim, his friend had clawed the walls of his bedroom to the point where his nails came out. That's how he knew that he needed to escape. But Kim also knew that it wouldn't be easy. He had a family in North Korea that he didn't want to leave behind, meaning that any escape plan he formulated would have to involve them. So Kim started talking to his brother. It was an easy task to convince him along with his wife. Kim's brother had made a living by selling illicit seafood. The state cracked down, making it impossible for him to fish even though he had his own boat. When Kim came calling, he found a brother who was more than willing to plan an escape with him. That was mid-2022. The brothers spent 7 months plotting their escape from there, though they soon ran into challenges. Many of the traditional escape routes, such as those along North Korea's northern border with China, had been cut off during the pandemic, meaning crossing over on foot was not an option. Thankfully, it wouldn't have to be. Both Kim and his brother lived in the southwest of the country, giving them another choice for escape: by sea to South Korea. But they simply couldn't jump into Kim's brother's boat and set sail. Permission to access the waters they'd use in their escape was needed, leading to Kim's brother enrolling in a military scheme. He would have permission to enter the waters, the military said, as long as he caught fish that the soldiers could sell to fund their equipment. As Kim's brother set to work in a, quote, official capacity, Kim himself started speaking to the security guards and coast guards who patrolled the coast. He made friends with several, learning about their shift patterns and protocols, until he realized that with the right timing, he and his brother could take their boat out at night without being caught. The plan started to take shape. But Kim still had another important task to complete: convincing his wife and elderly mother to make the trip with him. Neither wanted to go. The risks were simply too great. Eventually, through a lot of shouting and cajoling, Kim convinced his mother to make the trip by telling her that he wouldn't leave without her and that she'd be responsible for his misery if she stayed. Some may see this as an underhanded tactic, but to Kim it was necessary to ensure his family stayed together. Unfortunately, his wife proved a tougher nut to crack. She was steadfast in her refusal to leave until she discovered that she was pregnant. Kim successfully argued that he and his wife were now going to be responsible for another life and that they shouldn't raise their child in a hellhole. There was still more to do before Kim could execute his plan. Fearful of how the state might treat his father's grave when he left, desecration of graves of defectors' relatives is apparently common in North Korea. Kim boldly dug up his father's remains, taking the body into the nearby wilderness. Kim says he burned it to ashes, packing the cremated remains into an urn to take with him. For the first time in a long time, his family was united. However, before they could make the trip, Kim would need to navigate a minefield in the dark to reach his brother's boat. Pretending to pick herbs, Kim slowly mapped out a route through the mines, which had been recently planted to stop people from leaving. It was a risky gambit, but Kim knew this area wasn't well patrolled because the mines were supposed to be enough to stop people from running. He took his time, worked out his route, and with the minefield successfully mapped, he had one thing left to do: wait. Kim needed both the weather and the tide to be in his favor if his escape was to be successful. So he waited until a day when the low tide and rainy weather could be used to obscure his escape. He didn't need clear weather. That would make his boat easier to spot. Kim needed a day when the sea warning was in place, which would usually only come when a storm was brewing. He'd then have a chance to use it to obscure himself from North Korea's radar systems, gaining enough ground without being spotted that he could make his final push successfully. The big day came. On May 6th, a sea warning was issued and the tide was coming in. Kim and his family sneaked through the minefield and got to his brother's boat. By 10 p.m., they were in the water, sailing as far as they were permitted under his brother's agreement with the military. And then they kept going. The low tide worked in Kim's favor. It exposed rocks, boulders, and reefs, all of which Kim and his family used to disguise their small vessel from the radar systems designed to catch unapproved boats in the water. That, combined with the rain, allowed Kim to camouflage his vessel as floating rubbish. Slowly but surely, Kim's boat edged toward the maritime border until he felt it was safe to pick up speed. Then he activated the throttle. According to Kim, he looked back to see a large ship following. The state knew that he was escaping, but the vessel it had sent simply wasn't fast enough to keep up. Kim and his family managed to ride the currents until they crossed the maritime border into South Korea. In that moment, all my tension released, said Kim. I felt like I was collapsing. Free for the first time of North Korea's oppression, Kim sailed his brother's boat toward the island of Yeonpyeong, flashing his lights as he did until the South Korean Navy spotted and rescued him and his family. However, he wasn't yet free to start his new life. Ever wary of North Korean spies, the South Korean National Intelligence Service detained Kim and his family for interviews to determine if they were truly defectors. Satisfied with Kim's answers, the service then placed him and his family into a resettlement facility where they were taught about life in South Korea. The transition would be tough. In October 2023, the family moved into an apartment together, just in time for Kim's wife to give birth. Small things that seemed so common to most, such as riding the subway, were alien to Kim and his family. But they are adapting, and with time, they'll fully ingratiate themselves into their new society. It feels like I was born a second time, Kim says when talking about his new life. Speaking to the Japan Times, he says that he'd never seen a plane flying through the sky when he lived in North Korea. Now he sees them regularly, and thanks to a special job fair held for North Korean defectors, he has a chance of landing his dream role as a ship's navigator. Mr. Kim's escape set the blueprint for how North Korean defectors escaped the country in 2023. In the days when several thousand people left North Korea every year, the country's border with China used to be the default choice. As Pastor Stephen Kim, who works for JM Missionary to help North Koreans escape via China, points out, about 1,000 people used to make their way over the Chinese border annually. Since the pandemic, that number has dropped to just 20, with Kim saying that he only knows of 4 of those escapees who managed to make their way to South Korea. Others he suspects were detained in China and possibly sent back to North Korea. That leaves only the sea as an option for escape in 2023. As Sukil Park of Liberty in North Korea points out, he says that the types of escapes conducted by people like Mr. Kim have always been rare, unsurprising given what we know of Kim's story, and that many likely don't succeed. These sea escapes take meticulous planning, incredible bravery, and for everything to go miraculously well, he says. There must be many more North Koreans who have tried but not made it. Mr. Kim was one of the lucky ones. Though not all of the details of his daring escape have been independently corroborated, it's clear that he placed himself and his family in immense danger to build a new life. And he's not the only one. Though Kim's account is the most detailed story we have from a North Korean defector in 2023, he's not the only one who braved the harsh waters. In October 2023, several news outlets, including Al Jazeera and the BBC, reported on a small group of suspected defectors who were discovered by the South Korean Coast Guard. The group of 4 had made their crossing in a small wooden boat, all claiming to want to defect to South Korea. They were found on the coast near Sokcho, a city just 32 miles away from Seoul. Though few details are known about this group, they were likely treated the same way as Kim and his family, meaning that they would have been detained and questioned before being sent to a resettlement facility. But in this case, the South Korean authorities are still remaining tight-lipped, perhaps to protect the anonymity of these defectors. Still, it appears that they followed the blueprint created by Mr. Kim. Their small wooden boat was agile enough to evade the larger ships patrolling North Korea's waters. The craft was also inconspicuous enough to blend in with the boulders and reefs that appear on the country's coast during low tide. Like Kim, these 4 defectors took a massive risk, and sadly, any future defectors will likely have to do the same. After all, crossing over into China isn't an option anymore, and that's not solely because North Korea has shored up its defenses against defection across the border. China appears to be cooperating with North Korea. In December 2023, the South China Morning Post reported on a visit made by a senior North Korean diplomat to Beijing. These rare talks are apparently part of China's efforts to strengthen its relationship with North Korea, with the 2 parties agreeing to improve their, quote, strategic communication and coordination. What that might mean on a geopolitical scale isn't fully known, but for any who wish to escape from North Korea into China, this increased cooperation spells bad news. A Reuters report published just days before the South China Morning Post article points out that North Koreans who were in China have started, quote, disappearing. Reuters highlights information from the Transitional Justice Working Group, or TJWG, which claims that China sent 600 North Koreans back for repatriation in October alone. TJWG says these 600 people have simply vanished, and it warns that they likely face imprisonment, perhaps in North Korea's labor camps, as well as sexual violence and execution now that they're back home. TJWG says that the defectors were loaded onto buses and vans to be driven back to North Korea, with the incident being the largest mass repatriation in many years. Most of those sent back were women. Their prospects don't look good, especially given that North Korea's state media brands defectors as, quote, human scum. For its part, China has downplayed its actions, claiming that North Koreans they sent back weren't true defectors. Instead, they had entered China for economic reasons, with Beijing sending them back being a simple case of them following the letter of their own law. Many would disagree. From the outside looking in, it would appear as though a deal has been struck. In exchange for North Korea's cooperation, China is sending defectors back to a country that will treat them as less than human. It's essentially a death sentence. Escaping into China simply isn't an option anymore. And it wouldn't be surprising to see more groups being sent back to Pyongyang as ties between China and North Korea strengthen. So, North Korean defectors are faced with a near impossible choice. On the one hand, they could try to take advantage of the fact that North Korea has recently reopened its borders with China to try to escape the traditional way. It won't be easy. Even with trade routes reopened, Pyongyang has boosted border security to the point where it's much harder to cross now than it was before the pandemic. And even if somebody manages to make the crossing, they'll enter a country that's just as likely to send them back as it is to accept them. Or they do what Mr. Kim and his family and the 4 defectors found huddled in a small wooden boat did: brave the dangerous waters that separate North and South Korea. Believe it or not, that might be an even more difficult route out of North Korea. Minefields near the coast, patrolling ships, radar systems, they all combine to stop most escape attempts, even if the few who are successful at least make it to South Korea and a new life where they're accepted and rehabilitated. Alternatively, there is a third option. According to the NK News, the third quarter of 2023 saw 40 North Korean defectors leave China to reach South Korea. The outlet says that the threat of repatriation is so high that the defectors are essentially willing to defect again, leaving the place that they've called home for several years to avoid the possibility of being sent back to North Korea. Hannah Song, who works for North Korean Human Rights, one of the few organizations allowed to interview defectors after they leave, says that most of the 40 came from China and that many had spent 10 years or more there. Perhaps 2 border crossings over land would be safer than 1 via sea. By crossing into China before immediately making their way to South Korea, defectors may have a chance to start their new lives without braving minefields and the North Korean Navy, but they'll still face risk. Beyond mass deportations, China is estimated to be holding 2,000 North Koreans in prison, according to the United Nations. Cross to South Korea by sea, start a covert life in China, or use China as an opportunity to cross into South Korea. All are near impossible routes of escape, and yet over 300 North Koreans have made it via these routes in 2023. Will 2024 see more escapees manage to follow in Mr. Kim's footsteps? Only time will tell. Relations between North and South Korea have been rather tense for some time, which might be an understatement. But this year, we saw North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, walk over the border to shake hands with South Korea's president, Moon Jae-in. Until then, most South Koreans, and most of the world for that matter, saw the North's head honcho as some kind of evil dictator. After the meeting, some South Koreans referred to him as a cute teddy bear. So, is everything okay now, following handshakes and slaps on the shoulder? Well, even though a third summit has been proposed between the two leaders, right now the North isn't exactly in the USA's good books. South Korea's big brother certainly watches over this relationship like a brooding mother. Let's have a look at how this division started in this episode of the Infographics Show. Why did North and South Korea split? You probably already know that North and South Koreans are very similar in many ways. Even culturally, the language is pretty much exactly the same, except for a few small differences. You could say that North Korea likes to keep the language free from impurities, such as borrowing words from English. But besides regional dialects being slightly different, we can say you speak Korean, not North or South Korean. North and South Korea originally came together in the 7th century under the Silla dynasty, and they remained united up until 1945. So what happened? How could a country united for so long suddenly just split in two? The answer is war, the Second World War. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Prior to the Second World War, there was something called the First Sino-Japanese War, which was a war between China and Japan between 1884 and 1895. Based on the Western industrial model, Japan had become a very powerful country in the 19th century. No longer a backwater, as the members of the British Empire used to call it. Japan emerged as an empire itself. Korea, on the other hand, had been rather fearful of foreigners and Western industrialization, especially the elite that ruled over the country. They didn't want outsiders messing in their business. But then, in 1880, things started to change. Korean diplomats went on a mission to Japan that year. While in Japan, they were presented with a study from a Chinese diplomat which was called A Strategy for Korea. In part, that study warned that the Russians were coming. It also said, "Stay friendly with us, the Chinese, and don't get on the wrong side of Japan." Japan wasn't an immediate threat at that time, but the Chinese diplomat advised the Koreans to stay close with the burgeoning nation. At the same time, Korea was also advised to form good relations with the United States, who also could provide protection from the Russian juggernaut. In 1882, Korea signed a treaty with the US called the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation. So far, so good. Open trade, modern industries, and the bonus of added protection. But there was a catch. The Chinese wanted the treaty to say that Korea belonged to China. The Americans were not keen on that and insisted that Korea was independent. In the end, they agreed that Korea had a kind of independent status but was still a tributary state of China. To cut a long story short, China had a massive influence on Korea and tried to reform the country. That was in line with embracing some Western ideals and using Western technology. So Korea became more modernized to some extent. China just kept pushing and soon was involved in running Korea as well as dispatching its own troops there. We can't spend too much time on this, but the war between the Japanese and China was fought partly in Korea. Japan came out on top, and in 1910 the country annexed the Korean peninsula. From then until the end of the Second World War, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. This wasn't exactly great news for many Koreans, as some historians say the Japanese treated them like second-class citizens. But then, the war ended, and Japan was on the losing side. What to do with Korea? That was in the hands of the winners, the Allied powers. "No more empire for you," said the Allies to Japan. It was up to the USA to take over the administration side of Korea, but it wasn't keen on the idea of running the country. The Soviet Union was keen and wanted the land it thought it deserved. Russia had lost a war with Japan in the early 20th century called the Russo-Japanese War. That's why the Soviets, to some extent at least, thought they deserved control of Korea. Underdeveloped Korea for so long had been standing between these giants of Japan, China, and Russia, and basically everyone at some point wanted a piece of it, or should we say, all of it. It was actually quite surprising that the Japanese had defeated the Russian Empire, and so perhaps Russia had been left with some egg on its face. After winning wars both against China and Russia, the West knew that Japan certainly was a mightier power, but that ended with its defeat at the hands of the US in the Second World War. Two Americans called Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel had the responsibility of making borders in the US-occupied territories in East Asia. They came up with the idea of splitting Korea into two, almost in half, divided by what's called the 38th parallel. This was done without Korea having a word in it. The Americans said that half the country would be run by the Soviets and half by them. Not surprisingly, America got the better half of the cake, which included the more modern city of Seoul. That's not to say the North was an outback. It too had many major heavy industries. The South had the light industries. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and President Roosevelt agreed to the split, while the Koreans were not even invited to the meeting. Of course, many Koreans were passionately against this, but not those that had ties to the Soviet Communist Party. Actually, at the end of the war, many Koreans from the North and South were over the moon. Finally, they would get their independence back. Brothers in arms, they embraced and planned for the future together. But of course, that didn't happen. Brothers in arms were about to become quarreling siblings. Soviet forces quickly took control from the Japanese forces in the North, and in the South the same happened with the Americans. Easy. Well, not really. The US, as we know, was afraid of the spread of communism as one might fear an outbreak of Ebola. The country didn't even want any of the South Korean political parties to have much say in how the now half country was run, just in case they leaned ever so slightly to the left. As things turned out, the US wanted both North and South to have a democratic government and democratic principles, while the Soviets wanted the entire peninsula to be communist. Now we have a divide of the former two allies, although America had been wary of communism for a long time. The US and Soviet leaders were even supposed to meet in 1948 to discuss the idea of reunifying Korea and leaving the country to its own devices, but both countries were so afraid of the other that this didn't happen. In 1948, the Americans pretty much installed their own idea of a good leader for the South, a staunch anti-communist called Syngman Rhee. The Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as leader. He'd been a fighter in the Red Army and of course was a puppet for the Soviet Empire, as much as Rhee was the puppet for the empire that dare not speak its name, i.e. America. Like Stalin, the North had to be ruled by a godlike character, and a cult of personality was sown into the minds of those Koreans living in the North. You must remember, at this point, the Koreans were still just Koreans. They'd been split in half without any say in it. Of course, many North Koreans weren't on board with such things as supreme leaders and all that attendant propaganda. But if you've read Plato, you'll have heard of the noble lie. Plato said that if the elite must rule, they must tell a huge whopper, create a mythology for the not-so-clever public consumption. Plato said that it was noble because the normal folks need this lie to bring them together under one great myth, just as religion brought people together under one truth. Plato said if the first generation don't buy it, the second will mostly, and you'll have the third completely if you fill their heads with this idea from being children. That's how many North Koreans became so enamored with their godly leader. Well, that and fear. But then, in 1950, Kim Il-sung got ambitious and decided he wanted to rule the whole peninsula. That was the start of a 3-year-long war called the Korean War. The Americans joined the South with other countries of the United Nations, and they defeated the North. 3 million people died, and in the end, nothing at all really changed. Korea was still divided at the 38th parallel. After that, the demilitarized zone was set up to prevent more blood from being spilled, and to prevent people from reuniting or escaping. People did get through though, most of them Northerners trying to get into the South. Both countries, though, soon became enemies, or at least enemies in ideals. The North was strictly communist with his Korean Workers' Party, and the South espoused capitalism, individual freedom, and American values. The Americans have kept bases in Korea since. As you watch this, there are about 28,000 US troops based in South Korea. Will they stay or will they go? It's May 1951 and the Korean War has been raging for a year. The world is still weary from the ravages of World War II, and the United States is the only nation capable of leading a UN response to the attempts by the Communist North to seize South Korea and unify the peninsula by force. The conflict has set the stage for a defining age in human history, the Cold War, and soon a regiment of American soldiers will find that curious visitors from another world may also be interested in how this war plays out. The Americans are 60 miles north of Seoul. The jungle is thick and oppressively hot. The North Koreans have been pushed back from South Korea in a brilliant pincer movement carried out by US forces. Rather than risk being destroyed completely, North Korea forces quickly retreated into the north as US-led NATO troops attempted to encircle them with an amphibious landing in the north. Despite these military successes though, the troops are nervous. At every sunrise, every man on the front lines has one question on their lips. Have the Soviets joined the war? Have we finally started World War III? Private First Class Francis P. Wall and his platoon are providing security for an detachment of artillery, which is itself preparing to rain down fire on a village full of North Korean forces. Men watch the jungle around them cautiously, despite being a few miles from the official front. Raiding parties against the American artillery are not uncommon. The artillery is set to fire just before dawn, and the villagers below have all been warned of the impending attack and told to flee. As the hour approaches, the big guns begin opening up. Artillery shells whiz through the air, bursting just above the village and showering the North Korean troops below with deadly shrapnel. The thunderous booms echo across the hills as a dozen guns open up one by one and deliver death to the enemy. Suddenly, though, Private Wall and other men responsible for providing security for the artillery see something in the hills above the village. It seems that the bombardment has attracted the attention of something none of the men will ever be able to explain. The light is dim at first, but quickly grows in brightness as it moves down the jungle hill. To the Americans, it appears like a floating jack-o'-lantern, emitting some kind of light from its body that is at first orange in color. To their shock, the light moves just over the village, even as the American artillery continues to pour fire into it. The air-bursting shells detonate all around it, and then the light does something incredible. In a move that defies all known physics, the light is able to rapidly move to the side of an exploding shell, avoiding being directly hit by the rounds. Even avoiding a direct hit, the object, which by now the men know must be some sort of craft, must have some sort of protective shielding, as it's still being showered by frag from the exploding artillery shells. Even if it is receiving any damage though, the Americans on the ground are unable to tell and simply watch in awe for almost an hour as the craft weathers the bombardment of the village. Then, the craft turns its sights on the Americans. With no warning, the craft turns in place and now moves directly toward the American position. The men are nervous. Nothing in their training has prepared them for this. Is it a secret Soviet craft? perhaps based on stolen Nazi technology? The speculation runs wild as the men prepare for what might be an attack on their position. Private Wall asks his company commander for permission to fire on the object as it approaches, using his M1 rifle loaded with armor-piercing rounds. His company commander agrees, and as the object approaches still bathed in orange light, Wall and his squad mates open up. Their fire is accurate and the craft comes under fire from several rifles. If the craft was employing some sort of protective shielding against the artillery shrapnel blast, it must have dropped it because the men are able to clearly hear the metallic sides of the craft ringing out from the sounds of their bullets striking it. As the men fire, a few of the armor-piercing rounds must have found their mark, piercing the strange craft. Suddenly, the craft goes wild. The lights begin flickering on and off erratically, and the craft makes crazy sporadic movements from side to side. At one point, though, the craft remains floating in the air above the GIs. The lights go completely off, but then seems to flicker back to life. The Americans on the ground, worried that the craft is going to either explode or come crashing down on their heads. Then, the craft seems to regain its stability, and suddenly the mountain valley is filled with the unbearable sound of what seem to be dozens of diesel train locomotives starting up all at once. The craft begins pulsing bluish light and attacks the soldiers below. As the men watch helplessly, the craft sweeps a ray across the battlefield below it. The brightly colored ray seems to come in pulses that the men can only see when it sweeps directly over them. Like car headlights or a searchlight in the dark, the craft sweeps this ray across the ground below it, seeking out soldiers where they lay in their fighting positions. As it sweeps over each man, they're racked with a burning, tingling sensation all over their flesh. The company commander immediately shouts for his men to take shelter from their bunkers. Small dugouts reinforced with plywood and sandbags. The bunkers offer protection for their men from the artillery bombardments, and the soldiers dive below the ground to take shelter from the mysterious ray. From inside these bunkers, the soldiers are able to watch the craft through small peepholes. Some of them even start returning fire from small firing slits. The craft suddenly blasts the entire area with a bright light, turning night into day briefly. Perhaps frustrated by the men safely out of its grasp in their bunkers, the craft then pulses with light once more and without warning shoots off at a 45-degree angle. To the astonishment of Private Wall, the craft seems to fly off at impossible speed, quickly being lost to the starry night sky. Lingering in their bunkers, it's a few minutes before the men work up the courage to leave the safety they offer. The company commander quickly calls for a meeting, and to a man, the soldiers all agree on one thing. They aren't telling a soul about what they just experienced. While each day the company is expected to file a report on its activities for the day, the company commander agrees it's best to leave this one off the books for now, for fear that they'll all be thought of as crazy. At the time, there's no such thing as UFOs in the public consciousness, and while mysterious stories of World War II Foo Fighters circulate through the military, nobody has yet made the link between their appearances and otherworldly alien visitors. Better then to keep everyone's mouth shut so they don't end up locked up in the loony bin. However, a few days later, the men of the 25th Infantry Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company start to fall ill. They're nauseous, they have terrible headaches and diarrhea. So many of them are affected at once that the army has to cut a road through the jungle to send ambulances and evacuate many of them. When doctors examine them, they find the men have extremely high counts of white blood cells and seem to be suffering from dysentery. After the war, Private Wall would struggle with PTSD and drop from 180 pounds to 136. The weight loss would be permanent, and the private would struggle all his life with weight issues as he struggled to recover to his normal weight. An official explanation for the event was never given, and with no official report filed, an investigation was never conducted. Whatever the men saw that night in Korea, though, was not a one-time incident, as GIs all across the conflict would tell very similar stories. For years, the mysterious craft are thought to possibly be Soviet secret weapons, but when those weapons never materialized in Soviet arsenals, the men involved would be forced to look for more otherworldly explanations. As the Cold War came to an end, it was revealed that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets were also encountering strange alien craft. Some even allege that the Soviet military had been involved in a conflict with underwater alien beings. According to allegedly secret documents leaked by former Soviet intelligence officials turned whistleblowers, military divers encountered a strange being in a silvery diving suit with a bubble-like helmet. When they returned to the area later to try and capture it with a net, the divers were forcibly sent upwards toward the surface by an invisible force. Their quick ascension from 50 meters down gave many of the men the bends. However, others argue that UFO sightings in wartime in Korea or even during the Cold War were nothing more than simply the effects of severe stress on the human brain. with both sides acutely aware that a full-scale global war could erupt at any time. Plus, with the stress of normal combat, the mind may play tricks on some people, even creating outright hallucinations. Plus, as some have pointed out, the symptoms that Private Well described are similar to regular dysentery. Whatever the truth is, wartime UFO sightings are nothing new, and the Korean War is seen by many as the floodgate opening up to what would become a full-blown alien incursion of planet Earth. Perhaps this isn't as surprising as it might seem though. After all, this was just years after the United States developed a working nuclear weapon, propelling humanity into the atomic age. And shortly after, the world found itself in the grip of a potentially civilization-destroying Cold War. Could aliens have been interested in how this part of human history played out? If reports from Korea are true, the answer may be a very frightful yes. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to have unlimited wealth and power, you're definitely not alone. Who hasn't dreamed of living like an all-powerful leader, with endless wealth surrounded by people catering to your every whim? To find out what it's really like to live like the wealthy dictator, supreme leader of an isolated hermit kingdom, let's take a look at how rich Kim Jong-un actually is, and how North Korea's dear leader really spends his fortune. The secretive nation of North Korea is home to 25 million citizens who for the most part live in extreme poverty and isolation. The average North Korean only earns around $2,000 a year, and it's estimated that upwards of 40% of the population is severely undernourished. It's no secret that Kim Jong-un is the richest man in North Korea, but exactly how rich is he? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. North Korea is often referred to as a hermit kingdom because of how isolated and cut off from the rest of the world the country is. The leaders of North Korea control every detail of their citizens' lives, including the media and internet access, so getting accurate information about the secretive country is difficult, to say the least. No official estimates of Kim Jong-un's wealth exist, so he was excluded from the Forbes list of the world's richest people. However, Forbes did list him as the 36th most powerful man in the world, since he has absolute control over his country and his people. In 2013, a joint South Korean and American investigation set out to determine exactly how much Kim Jong-un is worth. Based on what little information they could scrape together after months of tireless research, they determined that Kim Jong-un has a net worth of at least $5 billion, hidden away under false names in secret foreign bank accounts in places like Austria, Switzerland, Russia, and Liechtenstein, just to name a few. The bulk of his fortune appears to be held in China, where many accounts with millions of dollars in cash in them can be traced back to the supreme leader and his family. If the estimate is right, a $5 billion net worth would rank him near number 320 on the Forbes list of the world's richest people, alongside some of the world's most successful financiers and media moguls. Kim Jong-un was certainly born into a rich and powerful family, but he never expected to have the level of wealth and power that he now enjoys. As the second son of his father, previous Supreme Leader Kim Jong-il, his older brother Kim Jong-chol was favored to be the next leader of North Korea. But all that changed when Kim Jong-chol was caught trying to enter Japan with a false passport. He claimed that he simply wanted to visit Disneyland in Tokyo, but the damage was done. He had embarrassed the North Korean regime, and his position as favorite son went to his younger brother Kim Jong-un, who many considered to be a carbon copy of his father. Kim Jong-un also had another half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, who had enjoyed his father's favor for a few years. This must have made him a threat in Kim Jong-un's eyes, because after he came to power, Kim Jong-nam was attacked with a nerve agent at a Malaysian airport and assassinated in 2017. So now that Kim Jong-un has secured his hold on his unlimited power and wealth, how does he actually go about spending his fortune? Does he spend it on improving the lives of his people and bringing North Korea out of the dark ages? No. Kim Jong-un was raised in a lifestyle of luxury, and his tastes have only gotten more exorbitant since he took power. Kim Jong-un attended high school at a Swiss boarding school under a false name, and that may be where he developed his penchant for luxury watches. According to some sources, Kim Jong-un has a personal watch collection worth more than $8 million. Kim and his wife are often seen wearing expensive watches, and he frequently uses luxury timepieces as gifts for high-ranking party members. In recent years, though, Kim has had trouble getting his fix of luxury watches from Switzerland, after the UN banned the export of luxury goods to North Korea in reaction to their nuclear program. Former schoolmates of Kim Jong-un, who knew him back then as Pak-un, the son of an embassy worker, also remember his obsession with basketball. Apparently, basketball is a family tradition. Kim's father, Kim Jong-il, was a huge Chicago Bulls fan, and he even tried unsuccessfully to arrange for Bulls superstar Michael Jordan to visit the Hermit Kingdom during his reign. Kim Jong-un must have felt like he was living a childhood dream come true in 2013 when basketball legend and Hall of Famer Dennis Rodman made his first visit to North Korea. The controversial star has been back to North Korea many times since and has called himself a friend for life of the supreme leader. While upwards of 40% of the population of North Korea is undernourished, Kim Jong-un enjoys stuffing himself full of the finest food from around the world. It's estimated that he spends millions of dollars a year feeding himself and his innermost circle with the world's best cuisine. Kim favors the finest quality pork from Denmark, black Iranian caviar, Japanese Kobe beef, and fresh melons from China, all while his people subsist on a meager diet of rice and kimchi. Another habit he picked up from boarding school in Switzerland was an obsession with cheese. According to some inside sources, Kim's diet consists almost completely of cheese, and that he's been known to make himself so sick that he's had to take breaks from public life after gorging himself on shipments of Emmentaler cheese from Switzerland. Some believe he's intentionally trying to fatten up to look more like his grandfather Kim Il-sung, the much revered and rotund first supreme leader of North Korea. In a country where most people are starving, a full figure is seen as a symbol of wealth, and his weight gain might be meant to signal to his people that Kim is so rich he can afford to eat himself to death. Kim Jong-un may have inherited his love of food from his father as well. In 1997, Kim Jong-il hired the first Italian chef in North Korea, strictly to make pizza for the ruling family and their elite circles. Both Kim and his father were said to go crazy for pizza covered in meat, ham, pepperoni, prosciutto, and they ate it all up. No fine dining experience would be complete without a drink to wash all that rich food down. And of course, Kim Jong-un has the finest tastes in drinks too. He reportedly spends nearly $30 million a year importing Hennessy whiskey and the world's finest champagnes to pair with his pizza and cheese. He also spends nearly $1 million a year importing the finest Brazilian coffee. And of course, Kim Jong-un can't truly enjoy the world's fine coffee and most expensive liquors without a luxury cigarette. Kim, an avid smoker, is said to prefer imported French cigarettes that cost nearly $50 a pack and carries them in a $165 couture case. His love of cigarettes is so deep, in fact, that the investigators who looked into his finances back in 2013 are convinced that a huge portion of Kim Jong-un's wealth comes from the manufacturing of illegal drugs and cigarettes. Kim seems to have no reservations about building his fortune in the black market. Experts also estimate that North Korea makes at least $15 million a year from counterfeit currencies, and the UN estimates that North Korea hackers have stolen more than $2 billion from the global financial system. Kim Jong-un has no trouble spending away the results of his regime's nefarious activities, and his diet is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his outrageous spending. In 2012, human rights organizations put pressure on world leaders to stop exporting luxury goods to North Korea, while its people continued to starve. The official regime had been spending nearly $650 million each year on imported luxuries like exotic pets, electronics, and perfumes for its elites, while its people continued to live in utter poverty. Kim Jong-un is without a doubt the main beneficiary of the regime's lavish spending. Although he rarely leaves his hermit kingdom in North Korea, the supreme leader travels around his domain in style. He owns more than 100 luxury cars, including an armored Rolls-Royce Phantom 7 worth at least $500,000, and a collection of more than 30 Mercedes-Benz that he inherited from his father. His father was a Mercedes-Benz aficionado, and his favorite vehicle was the S600 Pullman Guard limousine, an armored limo that can withstand full metal jacket bullets and grenades and comes with a cool $1.5 million price tag. Kim is also rumored to have an Audi R8 V10 first generation. One of these highly desirable supercars was confirmed to be included in a shipment of 42 Audis from China to North Korea, and it could only have been meant for one man in the entire country, and that's just his personal fleet. As an absolute leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un also owns the nation's military fleet, with vehicles like the 9-axle transport erector launcher capable of carrying and launching North Korea's most powerful missiles. For longer trips, like his January 2019 trip to celebrate his birthday in China, Kim Jong-un travels in first-class style on board his personal armored train. After boarding the train via a red carpeted ramp, Kim can relax in plush pink leather chairs, sip some French wine, and nibble on some Swiss cheese. Or he can dictate orders to his minions from his onboard conference table and work on his secret plans on one of the many onboard Apple computers. And of course, an onboard chef is on hand to satisfy the supreme leader's slightest craving, serving up a menu of cuisines from around the world on demand. As if a bulletproof train in a fleet of luxury cars wasn't enough, Kim Jong-un also has his own private plane, a $1.5 million decades-old Soviet-made jetliner nicknamed Air Force Un. To top it all off, he also owns one of the finest luxury yachts, a $7 million, 200-foot-long floating pleasure palace that Dennis Rodman called a cross between a ferry and a Disney boat. With all the luxury transportation options you could dream of at his fingertips, Kim Jong-un is able to travel in style between 17-plus luxury homes and estates around the country. His main home is a nuclear attack-proof estate called the Central Luxury Mansion, located in the capital of Pyongyang and complete with its own underground train station. When he needs to kick back and relax, Kim can spend some time at the world-class luxury ski resort he ordered to be built shortly after he took power, or he can spend some time on his private island, which has its own shooting range and theater. Dennis Rodman spent time on Kim's Island during his 2013 visit and called it a 7-star party lifestyle full of the best food, booze, and luxuries the world has to offer. When it comes to the strangest ways that Kim Jong-un chooses to blow his fortune though, it might just have to be his collection of thoroughbred racehorses, which he uses extensively in his propaganda photos. Kim Jong-un has reportedly spent more than $500,000 importing horses since he's rose to power. While Kim Jong-un has introduced a few reforms during his reign, and he does project a more laid-back persona than his father and grandfather did, he definitely has a dark side. He appears to have systematically executed anyone he considers a threat to his power, including his own brother and uncle. And while the North Korean people starve, their dear leader goes on spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on fine food and other luxuries. I guess no one ever told him that great power comes with great responsibility. Which country has committed the worst war crimes of all time? It might not be who you think, and you'd be surprised how many good guys made the list. What is a war crime exactly? Well, it's a violation of the laws of war that leads to criminal responsibility beyond the standard killings of war. After all, if every killing in war was a war crime, they would have a backlog of millions of trials for both sides. But the crimes that can count as war crimes include killing or torturing of prisoners of war, targeting civilians, looting or pillaging conquered territory, killing surrendered soldiers, or committing acts of genocide or ethnic cleansing against conquered populations. But the concept of war crime itself is rather new. The codification of international law about the conduct of war didn't happen until the 19th century, with the Union Army in the Civil War having one of the first, and the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907 creating the first for international war. After World War II, when we saw the first widespread war crimes trials, the Geneva Convention formalized the process and created the international war crimes legislation that exists to this day. But that still lets some people off easy. Many of the worst crimes that would be war crimes today happened long before these laws were on the books, during the age of colonialism. So in judging the worst war crimes of all times, we have to look at them too, even if the leaders of the time got off scot-free or were even considered national heroes. So let's begin the list with two old-time rivals. Number 10, North Korea and South Korea. We'll kick it off with a tie. Today, it's easy to assume that the Korean War was a black and white affair. After all, when you look at the two countries today, one is a thriving democracy with a rich tourist scene, and the other is a militaristic dictatorship where only one family has ruled it since inception and public mood and behavior is strictly regulated. With North Korea seemingly threatening new conflicts every few days, the Korean War seems like a distant memory. But it was a bloody civil war and both sides committed terrible atrocities against the other, even before the US got involved on South Korea's side. And those atrocities were against their own peninsula mates and others. North Korea lived up to its brutal reputation from the start. North Korean troops were infamous for their no-quarter policy against the American troops. In one case, 5 airmen in a truck convoy were ambushed, and their bodies were found with over 20 stab wounds each, likely from bamboo spears. Those who were taken alive were usually stripped, tortured, and eventually murdered by their captors. No one was safe. When a non-combatant chaplain was captured attending to American troops at the Chaplain Medic Massacre, he was killed in the middle of administering the last rites to a dying soldier. But the South Koreans are no slouches to brutality either. South Korea during the Korean War wasn't the country it is today. It was a military dictatorship, and it was deeply paranoid about North Korean incursions. This led to brutal oppression of communist activities who were often imprisoned under poor conditions. When the North Koreans invaded, President Syngman Rhee took hundreds of political prisoners who had been imprisoned and ordered them executed, a mass killing of over 7,000 who were buried in mass graves. This was initially considered North Korean propaganda when alleged. Today, horrifying photos of the massacre have been leaked from US classified documents. But sometimes all it takes is a few years to launch a country into infamy. Number 9. Serbia When the Soviet Union fell, Yugoslavia was one of the many countries that was released from their sphere of influence, but unlike the others, it didn't stay one country. It split into multiple nations, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia. The massive former nation was filled with ethnic and religious conflicts, and it was not willing to give up any of its territory. The country had two separatist movements in what was then still known as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. These movements advocated for the independence of Montenegro and Kosovo, both of which had significant Muslim populations. And while the conflict had been brewing for a while, the new president of Serbia in 1991 planned to end the conflict in his favor, permanently. And it would become a world affair. Under the infamous Slobodan Milosevic, every independence movement was met with massacres. Serbian forces began taking mass numbers of prisoners in the Croatian War, with reports of torture and abuse in the prison camps. 35 cities were razed to the ground, and 3 million landmines were left behind. The same horrors followed in the Bosnia War, with several concentration camps being built. Most infamously, Serbian troops were found to have committed an active genocide in Srebrenica in 1995. Massacring over 8,000 Bosnian men and boys as part of an ongoing series of killings against the Muslim population of former Yugoslavia. But the worst was yet to come. These crimes were met with horror, but by 1999, Milosevic and his army had begun a full-on campaign of ethnic cleansing against Albanian Muslims in the territory of Kosovo. The Serbian army would systematically move from village to village, burning civilian property, robbing and killing civilians, and sending many people over the borders to Albania and Montenegro. Dozens of massacres were eventually exposed, and the horrors were so great that NATO decided to intervene, launching a bombing campaign that brought an end to the massacres, deposed Milosevic, and eventually led to him and many of his generals facing trials for war crimes. Today, Kosovo is independent, but many Serbians consider Milosevic a martyr and hold a deep, unabiding hatred for NATO and America. Now, let's head back, way back. Number 8. Spain. Spain has mostly stayed out of international conflicts for a long time, but back in the 15th century and beyond, it was the world's most powerful naval empire and the first to cross the Atlantic for colonial purposes. As soon as they landed in the islands of North America and beyond, the leadership had exactly one question: how much can we get out of this strange new land? That meant gold and other national resources, but it also meant land and people. In the grand colonialist tradition, as soon as Spanish fleets set foot in the Caribbean, Mexico, or South America, they decided that everything that was there belonged to Spain. Or any local was now a slave or completely disposable, and they had the perfect soldiers to carry out the missions. They were called conquistadors, and they were among the most feared figures of the 16th century. Starting with Christopher Columbus and followed by infamous figures like Cortez and Pizarro, they laid waste to countless ancient cultures, including the Inca, Maya, and Aztecs. Another culprit in this mass genocide was disease brought straight from Europe, which the natives were powerless against, and the Spanish did nothing to stop. But the Spanish also committed multiple massacres against men, women, and children. When they wanted control over a tribe or an empire, they would frequently kidnap the leader and hold them hostage, essentially having him hand over the empire at knife point. So, why aren't they higher? Simple. The Spanish Empire burned hot and fast. They would ultimately be eclipsed by other powers we'll see later on this list. As their colonial holdings dwindled, the war crimes they were responsible for did as well, and most of Spain's most infamous crimes in the modern era happened against their own people. In the brutal Civil War of the 1930s, both the fascist and anarchist movements were responsible for violence, but while the Republican side was mostly responsible for attacks against powerful institutions, Franco's nationalist movement was infamous for its brutal repression of anyone deemed to be insufficiently loyal to the regime. Mass graves were found in the years after the war, and it's only due to Franco's neutrality in the Second World War that the fascist leader isn't more widely known as a monster. Now, let's get to the big guns. Number 7. The United States. Alright, let's get it over with. This country has a lot to answer for in its early days, although it did inherit many of its worst crimes from the colonial period. The system of chattel slavery doesn't exactly qualify as a war crime, although it does qualify as a crime against humanity. However, many of the early conflicts with Native Americans on U.S. soil led to brutal massacres. Most infamously, President Andrew Jackson was a big fan of forced transfers of Native populations, including the Trail of Tears, where it's estimated as many as 15,000 natives died. The Civil War also led to no shortage of massacres, most infamously the hanging of 38 members of the Dakota tribe after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. But as the U.S. took a more global approach, things would escalate. After about 100 years of existence, the United States began to look more like an empire, with all the associated brutality. When the U.S. picked up the Philippines after defeating Spain in a war, their commander in the territory had a no-prisoners rule and ordered a massacre. It's believed as many as 5,000 people died in the initial massacres, and war crimes would continue for the duration of the occupation. During the Banana Wars in Haiti, the Americans were infamous for their harsh treatment of captives, including massacring rebels and torturing people for information. population, although their crimes in Haiti would pale in comparison to another global power. And as the US was pulled into larger conflicts, they didn't always abide by the laws of war. During World War II, the United States was accused of firing on Japanese survivors in lifeboats, and there were many reports of surrendered Japanese soldiers being killed. Some would be accused of taking trophies from Japanese bodies and of abusing Japanese women. As massacres of US POWs were common in Europe and the Pacific Theater, the US soldiers would often retaliate in kind. And then, of course, there's the two earth-shattering bombs that helped to end the war. Many say the mass killing of civilians at Hiroshima and Nagasaki count as war crimes, but the United States claims they were legitimate military targets. And it didn't stop there. The U.S. bombing campaign during the Vietnam War was infamous for its use of incendiary weapons, which led to heavy damage and civilian casualties. While there was no official policy of killing civilians, many commanders were known to have killed prisoners or even targeted villages of civilians. Justified, they said, because you never know who was a Viet Cong agent. Most infamously, at least 350 armed civilians were killed in the My Lai massacre, which led to the only conviction of atrocities in the war. In future wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, U.S. soldiers would also be accused of massacres and torture of prisoners, although those were usually met with much harsher condemnations and military trials than past wars. And their former rival could be no less infamous. Number 6. Great Britain. Probably the largest imperial power of all time. It used to be said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Britain wasn't the most brutal colonial power, but during its imperial age, it was well known for brutally punishing insurgencies and using famine to control the population. This was in far-flung colonies in Asia and Africa, as well as much closer to home in places like Ireland and Scotland. The first case where they committed crimes officially considered war crimes was in the Second Boer War in South Africa. The British troops would destroy towns, massacre livestock, loot villages, and open concentration camps for both Boer rebels and native Africans, leading to over 40,000 deaths. And then came the World Wars. Britain is generally not considered the aggressor in either of the two world wars, especially the second, but that doesn't get them off scot-free. While the use of chemical weapons was prohibited since 1899, both sides used them extensively in the First World War. The Royal Navy would also regularly kill unarmed soldiers whose ships had been sunk. During World War II, Britain would regularly violate the neutrality of countries trying to stay out of the war, including invading and occupying Iceland as a base against the Germans. Looting and torture of POWs were not uncommon. The British took heavy bombing against civilians during the war, and they returned it just as brutally in the bombing of Dresden, Germany, which killed 25,000 people. The British won the war with the Allies, but its time as an empire was slowly coming to an end. The years after the war would be characterized by the slow collapse of the British Empire, but not before more crimes happened around the world. In a conflict in what's now Malaysia, the British suppressed dissidents by placing people in internment camps and massacred 24 villagers of Batang Kali. A few years later in Kenya, Britain would brutally put down the Mau Mau uprising, which led to the internment of over 160,000 people and the hanging of over 1,000 suspected rebels. And while the British military is much less active than it used to be, Irish people who remember the Troubles probably have their own bill of indictment to provide. Their neighbor across the channel might have even more to answer for. Number 5. France. France was the third prong of the great European empires during the early colonial era, and it held on to its colonial holdings for a long time. France liked to style itself as a great civilizing power, but the reality was very different. While it offered citizenship to its subjects on a basic level, in reality those would be treated as second-class citizens who served to enrich the French colonists. For those who went along with the program, they could expect poor treatment, but for those who rebelled, that was usually where France's fangs came out, because independence movements tended to be met with brutal resistance. Algeria had been under French rule since 1852, and the country had around 100,000 European settlers in it. While initially the country was ruled by civilians, it was taken over by a military government soon after, and unrest increased. The French conquest led to brutal repression of the natives, with the European population doubling in only 10 years and land being taken from natives and transferred to the new settlers. It's estimated that war, massacres, disease, and famine led to the death of 1 million people within the first 3 decades of the French conquest, and Algeria would not gain its independence until the conclusion of a brutal war in 1962. But one country's fate might have been even worse. Haiti had been occupied since the 17th century and was called Saint-Domingue back then. It was heavily a slave state, with most of the indigenous Taino population being dominated by the French and dying in massive numbers within 30 years of the occupation. The French then imported large numbers of slaves from abroad. It's no surprise that this led to a slave rebellion, and France found itself overwhelmed in 1791, coming not long after the French Revolution threw the country into chaos. French colonial forces brutally tried to repress the slave rebellion, including possibly the first use of chemical weapons to massacre a large group of prisoners by filling a ship's hold with toxic gas. Haiti eventually did gain its independence in 1804, but not before being left with a massive bill by France in exchange for the damage that the rebellion did. But one colonial master might have slipped under the radar. Number 4. Belgium. Wait, Belgium? That little country in Northern Europe that rarely seems to start any trouble? How did they get up this high? You got it, colonialism. Specifically, possibly the most brutal colonial regime of all time in what was known as the Congo Free State. The name was an oxymoron. The territory that is now the Democratic Republic of Congo was an absolute dictatorship under the rule of the King of Belgium, King Leopold II. This ruthless leader saw the colony as simply just a place to harvest rubber, which was extremely valuable at the time. All the resources there belonged to him in his eyes, and so did all the people who essentially became the world's largest enslaved workforce. While initially this pseudo-colony was run by a supposed philanthropic organization and was an unprofitable mess handled by administrators, things changed once Leopold saw the opportunity for profit. He nationalized all vacant land, sold it off to private corporations, and gave them free rein to use the forced labor and abuse workers to maximize rubber production. These employees had far more to worry about than a negative performance review. Punishments for failing to meet quotas included mutilation, like having hands cut off, up to whole villages being razed as punishment for failure. And as time went on, these atrocities escalated. Under Leopold's rule, the Congo Free State was plagued by illness, with diseases like smallpox and dysentery ravaging the native population. Rebellions were punished severely, famine was common, and children would be kidnapped and put to work regularly. While Catholic missionaries ostensibly ran schools for the children, these were usually abusive institutions that did little more than train them to work in the rubber trade or serve as soldiers. All these effects together led to a dramatic decline in the Congolese population, leading many people to consider this one of the worst genocides in human history. In this one colonial holding, it's estimated that Leopold II might have killed as many as 10 million people. Now, let's head north. Number 3. Russia. There is a reason Russia is one of the most feared countries in the world. Its invasions were infamously brutal all the way back to the Tsarist era. But during the Soviet era and beyond, they really stepped up the war crimes. The Soviet Union began with the execution of the royal family, including the Tsar's children, leaving the citizens of Russia and the states it conquered subject to repression and famine under the new regime. Jewish populations were frequently subjected to government-sponsored pogroms, but during the World Wars they were almost as brutal as the Axis powers. They occupied areas including the Baltic states and western Ukraine and would engage in mass conscription of civilians who were often used as cannon fodder. And if you found yourself under Soviet occupation, it would be a long, brutal road ahead. While the Soviets did ultimately help win the war for the Allies, they had previously been aligned with the Nazis, and a joint invasion of Poland led to many atrocities. Soviet forces were infamous for their scorched earth policy, which saw countless villages burned and civilians massacred. Those taken prisoner had a high fatality rate due to the brutality of the Soviet labor camps. In the years after the war, the Soviets took many new territories, and Stalin's policies of collective farming and dekulakization led to the death of millions. Ethnic groups in the massive USSR were frequently oppressed and forced to conform to Soviet norms, with some of the major victims being the Greeks, Finns, and Soviet Jewish populations. The Soviet Union eventually fell, but the terror didn't stop. Boris Yeltsin's short reign was less militaristic than past ones, but his successor Vladimir Putin is challenging Stalin in the war crime department. He's faced down several separatist movements in his time, brutally putting down the Chechen separatists and chopping off parts of Georgia and Ukraine. Then in 2022, he shocked the world by launching a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, attempting to re-annex the country. While the war is ongoing and it's impossible to know exactly what's going on within Ukraine's borders, Russia has become infamous for targeting civilian infrastructure, attacking convoys of fleeing civilians, torturing and murdering prisoners, and kidnapping large numbers of Ukrainian civilians, including children, and deporting them into Russia. Now it's time to talk about the infamous Axis powers. Number 2. Germany. Much like its European brethren, Germany's colonial past is bloody, including what's considered to be the first genocide of the 20th century. The massacre of up to 110,000 Namibians in the colony of German Southwest Africa after they were driven out into the desert. In World War I, Germany was infamous for its use of poison gas and for its brutal occupation of Belgium starting in 1914. They ruthlessly bombarded English villages and targeted civilian ships with submarines, but many of the documents regarding German war crimes in World War I have been lost, actively destroyed by the government that sought to outdo them in every way. Yep, Time to talk about the Nazis. The Nazis led one of the most brutal regimes in human history, both toward their own people and to the countries they occupied. They were known for massacring prisoners of war, for committing atrocities against civilian villages, and for their campaign of mass genocide, primarily targeting the Jewish and Roma populations of Europe, but also the disabled, communists, and political dissidents. While this began with the German population, they expanded their campaign to every country they invaded, almost obsessively devoting their resources to rooting out these marginalized people and deporting them to a vast network of labor camps and death camps. So why aren't they number one? The Nazis might be the all-time champions in the general crimes against humanity, but in terms of war crimes, they did have a few scruples. Hitler himself had experienced mustard gas in World War I, which gave him a revulsion to the weapons and largely kept him out of the war. And while the Nazis had no problem abusing and killing prisoners of war, they did seem to have some fear of war crimes trials. When they ordered a commanding officer named Roddy Edmonds to identify the Jewish soldiers in his unit, he refused and claimed they were all Jews. That was enough to get the Nazis to back off, and the unit survived the war. But those few mitigating factors would do nothing to save the architects of the Nazi death machine from the gallows after the war. But they might just be outdone by their partners in crime. Number 1. Imperial Japan. The Empire of Japan had a relatively short history, but it made itself infamous during those decades. While they initially signed the 1929 Geneva Conventions, the government declined to ratify the one on prisoners of wars and wouldn't respect it on foreign prisoners. The government was highly militaristic, and their war crimes started before World War II broke out, with the infamous invasion of China. Taking place after the 1937 Battle of Nanjing in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese army celebrated their victory by killing at least 200,000 Chinese citizens and brutalizing much of the population. And that was just the first act. Once Japan officially entered the Second World War on behalf of the Axis powers and bombed the United States, they became infamous for their complete refusal to abide by any international standards on the treatment of prisoners of war or enemy soldiers. They would target civilian ships, downed airmen, and hospital ships, and regularly kill captured prisoners of war. Their attack on the United States is argued to be a war crime as well, since a sneak attack on the neutral power is considered a violation of the laws of war. But what truly earns them their top spot is their treatment of prisoners of war. Japan gained a reputation for mass killings of prisoners of war, forced labor, beatings, and most infamously human experiments in the infamous Unit 731, established on the orders of the Emperor himself. The victims, usually either prisoners of war or civilian captives, experienced tortures including testing of biological weapons, vivisection, amputation, and twisted experiments like the injection of horse blood into the bloodstream. This was all done without anesthesia, supposedly for scientific research, but likely just for sadism. It's no surprise that the Japanese rivaled the Germans in most war crime trials after the defeat of the Axis power. Imagine that you're a Canadian citizen who spent the last 20 years doing charity work in North Korea. You've visited the Hermit Kingdom more than 150 times without incident, which is why it's such a shock when one night, out of the blue, you're kidnapped. We mean arrested from your hotel room and accused of being an enemy of the state. Have you ever wondered what are prisons like in North Korea? Well, you're about to find out. This might seem like a far-fetched tale, but believe it or not, this is exactly what happened to a South Korean Canadian pastor who spent 919 days imprisoned in North Korea. His story is terrifying and brutal, but remarkably, he's one of the lucky ones. Many others who have experienced the horrors of North Korean prison firsthand have much darker tales to tell, but we'll get to that. First, let's find out how a Canadian pastor found himself on the wrong side of a tyrannical regime and ended up on the wrong side of a North Korean prison fence. Hyung-soo Lim was born in South Korea and moved to Canada as a young man, where he became a Christian pastor, married, and raised a family. Pastor Lim traveled back to South Korea often to visit his mother, and while there, began doing charity work with the poor just over the border in North Korea. Over the next 20 years, Pastor Lim would travel to North Korea more than 150 times. He was one of the few people in the world who had a special green Nexus-like ID card that allowed him to cross the notoriously difficult border dozens of times without incident. In January 2015, while Pastor Lim was visiting his mother in South Korea, he was contacted by a North Korean tourism official who requested an urgent meeting with him. Pastor Lim was surprised but not concerned, and he knew that when dealing with North Korean government officials, the safest option was just to go along with whatever they said. When Pastor Lim arrived at the border, a government official informed him that this meeting had been moved to a city 17 hours away by car. Pastor Lim knew better than to argue, so he threw his plans for a quick day trip out the window and got into the waiting car, a decision that would come back to haunt him. Shortly after Pastor Lim checked into the hotel room that had been so graciously arranged for him, 6 men armed with handguns rushed into the room, blindfolded him, and hustled him out of the hotel and into the back of a waiting vehicle. Pastor Lim begged the officers to tell him what was happening, where they were taking him, and if he was under arrest, but they ignored his desperate pleas. He was taken to a detention center near Pyongyang and deposited in a prison cell with no explanation. The dark, dank cell had no windows or furniture, just a concrete floor and a moldy toilet and sink. After weeks of interrogation, Pastor Lim finally learned what it was that had landed him in this cell. Apparently, someone in power had caught wind of one of his sermons on YouTube, in which he tells his flock not to treat the ruling Kim family as gods. Apparently, this was enough to have him labeled as an enemy of the state, and he was charged with harming the dignity of the supreme leadership of the country and trying to use religion to destroy the government. As relieved as Pastor Kim was to finally understand why he was here, he knew this was not good news. If found guilty, which, let's face it, he knew he would be, he could face life in a North Korean prison, or worse. After more than a year imprisoned in the small dank cell at the detention center, Pastor Lim realized his only hope was to confess and pray for mercy, otherwise he would die in his cell. In true North Korean form, Pastor Lim's trial was swift and his sentence was brutal. He was quickly proclaimed guilty and initially sentenced to death. Before Pastor Lim could wrap his mind around his impending fate, the judges conferred and, likely swayed by the presence of some Canadian diplomats, they downgraded his sentence to life in a labor prison. Unbelievably, relief washed over Pastor Lim as he realized his life had been spared, but that feeling wouldn't last long. He was about to find out what prison in North Korea is like. Life in North Korea is a bit of a prison sentence in and of itself. The country is so isolated and cut off from the outside world that it's earned the nickname of the Hermit Kingdom. While elite members of the authoritarian ruling class live in outrageous luxury, 40% of the North Korean population is malnourished. Tens of millions of North Korean citizens are trapped in a life of hard labor and extreme poverty, and under the tyrannical rule of Kim Jong-un and his cronies, they have little chance of improving their situation. They can only hope not to get on the wrong side of any power-hungry government officials, lest they find themselves in a true North Korean prison. Kim Jong-un is the all-powerful supreme leader of the so-called Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and he has unlimited control over all aspects of the lives of his citizens. As dictator of the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea, Kim Jong-un also presides over its appalling prison system. While North Korea officially denies the existence of these gulag-like prison camps, numerous reports from North Korean defectors as well as covert investigations into conditions in the country have revealed that not only do these atrocious camps exist, but they might be worse than anyone thought. Pastor Lim's experience in one of these prisons would expose some of the horrifying conditions faced by North Korean prisoners. After his trial, Pastor Lim was immediately whisked from the courtroom and into yet another waiting vehicle. He was forced to keep his head between his knees during the drive so he couldn't see where he was, until they arrived at an imposing concrete and barbed wire building in the middle of nowhere, Pastor Lim's new home, possibly for the rest of his life. Pastor Lim's new cell was hardly an improvement over his last one, but at least now he had a bed with a thin mattress, although he soon found it was infested with cockroaches. The building's tap water was undrinkable and the food was terrible. Rice full of dirt and thin white bread day after day, with a weekly boiled egg as a prized treat. The meager rations were not nearly enough to sustain him through the days of hard labor. Pastor Lim spent hours each day digging holes for apple trees in an orchard. Pastor Lim quickly began to fade away, losing 50 pounds or more than a third of his body weight and developing painful arthritis in his hands from digging in the sometimes frozen dirt. At one point, Pastor Lim was even hospitalized for 2 months before being shipped directly back to prison as soon as he recovered the tiniest bit of strength. Still, Pastor Lim focused on his faith and kept his spirits up as best he could. Over time, he was allowed more privileges, including a Bible and his much-needed blood pressure medication. He was soon allowed some limited contact with his wife, connected with some Canadian officials, and even gave a carefully controlled and government-approved TV interview. Pastor Lim even developed relationships with some of the guards, even helping one of them learn to connect with his teenage son. August 9, 2017 began like any other day. Pastor Lim was digging holes in the orchard when a guard came to him and told him to return to his cells and pack his things. He hardly dared to believe his dreams were coming true, as he was ushered into a hotel conference room full of Canadian and North Korean officials, signed his release papers, and boarded a plane headed for home. After 919 days in a North Korean prison, Pastor Lim was free. As horrifying as his ordeal was, Pastor Lim knows that he was one of the lucky ones. He didn't see a single other prisoner during his time in the North Korean prison, and he suspects that his Canadian citizenship spared him the worst of the harsh treatment experienced by North Korean prisoners. He even says he would consider going back to North Korea if allowed. And that seems insane to us, but to each his own, we guess. Even foreign citizenship isn't always enough to protect someone who finds themselves in a North Korean prison. In June 2017, an American student named Otto Warmbier died after he was found unresponsive in his cell in a North Korean prison. He had been serving a 15-year hard labor sentence for allegedly attempting to leave the country with a propaganda poster. Many others who've witnessed the horrors of a North Korean prison firsthand have much darker stories to tell. A former guard at one of those infamous prisons who defected to South Korea has exposed some of the most horrifying details of what goes on behind the barbed wire gates of a North Korean prison. She explains how the guards were manipulated and brainwashed to look at the prisoners as less than human. They were told that the prisoners were horrible monsters who had committed terrible crimes, though she was later devastated to learn that in many cases their crimes were no worse than foraging for food to feed their starving family or simply just being a Christian. In many cases, multiple generations of entire families were imprisoned together for the crimes of one family member in an effort to weed out the bad seeds. Once the guards could dehumanize the prisoners, they were able to treat them with a new level of brutality. On top of severe starvation and extreme physical labor to the point of collapse, guards would often brutally beat prisoners for the slightest indiscretion. Once, the former guard recalled an entire family, including children, being brutally beaten in retaliation for two of their family members escaping. The escapees were later caught and paraded through a crowd of prisoners who were forced to throw stones at the pair before they were publicly executed by beheading. In case you're trying to convince yourself that North Korean prisons couldn't possibly be as bad as the rumors and stories make them sound, you can rest assured that in reality it's actually much worse than we could have imagined. In 2017, the International Bar Association, that's the global professional association of the world's lawyers, so pretty legit, released the findings of their extensive investigation into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's Kwaliso prison system, and the report is sickening. Seriously, if you're squeamish, you might want to skip ahead about a minute or so. We're not kidding. Okay, so here it goes. Don't say we didn't warn you. According to the IAB's report, these are just a few of the worst atrocities committed in North Korean prisons. The report cites numerous incidents of prisoners being beaten and even executed for hiding food or digging for edible roots in the forests near the camp. There were countless reports of routine public executions of prisoners by hanging, beheading, or firing squad designed to subdue and demoralize the prison population. In one camp alone, a reported 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners, many just children, are starved and overworked to death each year. The report goes on to list many more accounts of similar atrocities at North Korean prisons. If you skip that last bit, we don't blame you. The truth about what prison is like in North Korea is not for the faint of heart. Thomas Bergenthal, one of the 3 judges on the IBA's panel, has a half-century of experience working on human rights cases, and he himself is a childhood survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. He has witnessed firsthand some of the worst human rights violations in recent history, and even he was shocked by the brutality of North Korea's prisons. He said, "Conditions in the North Korean prison camps are as terrible or even worse than those I saw and experienced in my youth in the Nazi camps and in my long professional career in the human rights field." That's pretty damning to say the least. As long as Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un maintains absolute control over North Korea and the lives of its people and prisoners, daily life in North Korea will continue to resemble a prison sentence, and those unlucky enough to find themselves behind bars in North Korea will likely face the most inhumane conditions imaginable. Now that you know what prison in North Korea is like, perhaps you'll rethink that summer vacation to Pyongyang. Hitler had his concentration camps, Stalin had his gulags, and North Korea has its dreaded labor camps. Every evil dictatorship has historically had a place to send any dissidents or perceived enemies of the state. And while many horror stories have circulated about the cruelty and brutality of North Korea's prison camps, exact details have been hard to confirm due to the secretive nature of the Hermit Kingdom. Yet as more North Koreans escape the brutal regime, never before heard details paint a grim picture of life inside one of the most hellish places on Earth. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're going to remind you to be grateful that you live a comfortable first world life as we answer the question, what do we know about North Korean labor camps? For most of our viewers, watching our show is nothing but an afterthought. But did you know that in North Korea, watching the Infographics Show can get you sent straight to a labor camp for 10 years? Not just our show, of course, but anything on the public internet. In fact, just owning a computer can be offense enough to warrant a trip to a labor camp, as computer ownership requires explicit permission from the government itself. And if you want to cruise the internet, you'll have to make do with a state-operated intranet, with internet access afforded only to government personnel. Anyone caught circumventing this ban is going to earn themselves a one-way trip to the modern gulag. But don't worry, because you won't be lonely in your new prison home. And that's thanks to North Korean founder Kim Il-sung's belief that evil could only be expunged from a family if you punished 3 generations of that family. So if your dad gets sent to a prison camp, then you're going right along with him, along with your sister, mom, and any immediate family, even if you're the model North Korean citizen. Then if you have a child in prison, that child will live out his or her days in that prison as well. But what is life like inside the prison camps? And what do they do exactly? Well, as many dictators have found throughout history, locking up dissidents is a pretty okay solution, and executing them outright is even better. However, why just lock them up or kill them when you can capitalize on the free labor that a prison population affords? Stalin most famously put tens of thousands of gulag prisoners to work in the Soviet Union in a bid to modernize his nation. In fact, Soviet political prisoners built much of modern Russia's infrastructure, to include the famous Moscow Canal, which was built by 200,000 prisoners, many of which died from the extreme conditions. Today, you can even take a romantic cruise down the Moscow Canal, literally sailing over the buried remains of slaves and on waters tamed by pure human misery. Just the thing to really set the mood. For North Korea, free labor is a very appealing prospect, especially since the nation is so economically impoverished. Prison laborers are often used in North Korea's mining industry, working without power tools and usually just pickaxes and shovels, and with absolutely zero safety regulations. Prisoners also farm food which is sent to Pyongyang, though of course they're not allowed to eat any of it, and if caught, they can be shot. Many camps include consumer goods such as furniture which goes on sale in Pyongyang department stores, while others create building materials to be used around the country. While this free labor pool must seem like a pretty convenient system for North Korea's dictators, the reality is that study after study shows that slave labor is far more inefficient than paid labor, and in actuality often costs more both in direct cost of security and in lost revenue due to inefficiency. Russia's famous Moscow Canal is estimated to have actually cost Russia millions of rubles due to the poor workmanship and slow progress of slave labor. So what are the conditions actually like inside the camp? Thankfully, the flood of North Korean defectors has revealed the secrets of these literal hells on earth. First, the camps resemble villages more than actual camps, with guards and their families living next to the camp itself. While some are fenced, many are not, and the extreme remoteness and hostile terrain coupled with the terrible nutrition of its prisoners is often enough to keep people from trying to flee. Then there's also the fact that guards will shoot on sight if anyone even appears to be running away, and if they can't catch you, they'll kill your family members which are left behind. Though guards are extremely motivated to catch prisoners because often if a runaway succeeds in escaping, the guards themselves will be executed, all in the name of preventing the secrets of forced labor camps from escaping the country. Guards themselves routinely physically and sexually abuse prisoners. Rape is rampant, and much like in the Soviet Gulag, female prisoners may trade sexual favors for a few bits more to eat, or simply be forced into the act by a guard. Prisoners are routinely beaten for even the most minor infractions, though the abuse isn't limited just to the guards. Because the families of guards often live at the camps themselves as well, family members happily get in on the abuse. One prisoner at a mining camp explained how family members of prison guards would order miners to kneel before them with their mouths open, and then they would spit phlegm directly into their mouths. If a prisoner spit it out, they would be beaten. But this prisoner said that you would gag immediately upon receiving a big wad of mucus in your mouth, which would be excuse enough for the tormentor to beat you. Sometimes, though, the beatings come from your fellow prisoners. One prisoner recounts how she and several other prisoners were forced to sit in the lotus position, and not allowed to move or stretch their limbs. After several hours of this, someone would inevitably move, which prompted the guards to order the other prisoners to beat this person. Grateful for the opportunity to stretch their own limbs, the prisoners would beat the offending prisoner mercilessly, knowing this was the only exercise they would get. Letting prisoners punish themselves is a favorite tactic for prison guards, and often prisoners would be punished as a group for the offenses of just one prisoner. One former prisoner explained how guards would withhold food, or in winter would not provide heating, nor allow the prisoners to build a fire. The stressed and angry prisoners would then vent their frustration on the offending prisoner, often beating them to death. Sanitation is all but non-existent in the camps, and running water is not available at all, even for the plumbing. One prisoner explained how prisoners would collect their own urine, which they would then use as water to soften their hardened stool, which they rubbed and pressed by hand. Then, they would roll up their clothes and hammer the softened stool down the drain, and after which would have to use the remaining urine to wash the stool off their hands. This would inevitably lead to rashes and infection, and many died from the unsanitary conditions. The lack of sanitation extended to field work as well, with one prisoner explaining how they were forced to take their own diarrhea and use it to fertilize the corn they grew. However, the guards insisted that they do so with their rice bowls, which they ate off of. They would only have ditch water with which to rinse their bowls in, and then at lunchtime would have to eat off that same bowl. Not that there's much food for prisoners to eat anyways. Prisoners are served 3 meals a day, but meals typically consist of around 150 corn kernels that are lightly salted. Prisoners will then supplement their diets any way possible. And one prisoner recalled how, despite the unsanitary conditions, there were no rats or insects to be found inside the prison because the prisoners ate them all. Dragonflies, butterflies, and pretty much anything that flew into the camp was caught and eaten, with pregnant rats being a delicacy because of the fetuses the rats carried inside it. Sometimes prisoners will light small fires with which to cook their caught rats or lizards, but if caught, they could be severely beaten by the guards. Therefore, most prisoners simply ripped their meals apart with their own hands and let the meat dry, then ate it raw. The forced labor in a camp typically consists of a 16-hour workday, matched by a quota that each prisoner was expected to achieve. This could be anything from pull X amount of weeds or mine X amount of coal, and if quotas were not met, then prisoners would forego food. Without food, prisoners would grow weaker, and thus new quotas would be even harder to achieve. Eventually, prisoners would simply starve to death. For prisoners, labor starts as young as elementary school age, and children to send into the mines or harvest lumber are in no short supply, thanks to the 3 generations rule. While on the job, injuries are common, with medical treatment completely non-existent. If you weren't cured by a folk remedy, then you would likely die, and injuries were no excuse for slacking off. Quotas would not change depending on your health, and thus starvation also adds to the cause of death for injured workers. After 16 or more hours of hard labor, prisoners can expect 2 hours of recreational time, during which their recreation consists of memorizing and reciting the camp's rules and regulations. If a single prisoner makes a mistake or fails to memorize the rules, his or her entire section is forced to start from scratch and continue until everyone can recite the rules perfectly. This cuts into sleep time, and with labor starting as early as 5 a.m., sleep is a precious commodity. Yet one prisoner who fled to the south explained how nighttime was the worst time of all. Prisoners were stuffed into small cells, 20 apiece, and sometimes you didn't have enough room to stretch your legs. Men and women were separated, though mothers were allowed to nurse babies. Prisoners would wail in pain as their bodies broke down from starvation, and women could be heard screaming, as nighttime was when the guards would come to round up women to be raped. Not just women though, children would also be rounded up for rape and torture, all as part of entertainment for the prison officials. Pregnancies were sometimes brought to term, with the baby growing up a prisoner, but often pregnant women or girls were simply beaten until they had a miscarriage. If prisoners misbehave or dare to rebel, they're severely punished, not just with beatings, which are routine, but with far worse punishments. One prisoner recalls how his camp had a special area for those being punished by the guards. This consisted of a specially tiny cell, where a prisoner could hardly move. The prisoner would be forced to sit in cold, muddy water for days or weeks at a time. If they survived the ordeal, prisoners would leave with their flesh rotting off their body. North Korea's labor camps are a blight on the face of humanity entering the 21st century, hellholes of human rights abuses. They're a reminder that despite the gleaming societies of the glowing list of first world nations, there still exists medieval dictatorships built on foundations of pure evil. The Kim family is but one of many of humanity's most vile dynasties, but these chubby, overweight dictators are a true blight on a world that has worked hard to leave its barbaric roots behind. If you ask us, Kim Jong-un needs to choke on a cheeseburger and leave this world behind already. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un has recently shaken up his military cabinet, while warning that the military must be prepared for imminent war. What does Kim know that we don't, or is this more bluster? And if war were to break out, just how effective would the North's military be against the South-US alliance? Military shakeups are nothing new in the highest echelons of power in the North Korean military. In fact, Kim Jong-un regularly shuffles around senior personnel, sometimes for perceived failures, but most of the time to keep any one individual from amassing too much power. After all, as a dictator, Kim Jong's greatest threats come from within. However, it was a chilling warning that the North Korean military should be prepared for imminent war that made many take notice of this shakeup. The nation spends around $4 billion on its military every year, or about 25% of the country's entire GDP. That's about what the US will spend on a single military program given its vast $800 billion defense budget. Its weapons are largely antiquated, training is considered to be poor to non-existent, and its logistics are believed to be even worse than Russia's, which is really saying something. Yet the punch the North Korean military has might just surprise you. By the numbers, there's really no comparison between the two powers. The only area where there's even remote parity is in the total number of active duty personnel. North Korea has around 1.2 million active duty personnel versus the US's 1.39 million. When it comes to reservists, North Korea enjoys the advantage with over 600,000 versus the US's 442,000. But there's a bigger story here than numbers. US soldiers are far better trained and equipped than their northern counterparts. The US Army alone is spending 4 times the total North Korean military budget on readiness and training in 2023-2024. In total, the US Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy, and Space Force are spending over 3 times the entire GDP of North Korea on training and readiness for the fiscal years of 23 and 24. This training includes individual and unit training, as well as large-scale combined arms exercises with partner services and foreign allies. The US trains how it fights, adopting the maxim that it's better to sweat in training than bleed in war, and the results are reflected in the one-sided loss ratios experienced by the US military. North Korean training is largely conducted at the unit level, with each unit responsible for individual proficiency. With very few exceptions over the last decades, a large-scale training exercise involving large formations or combined arms operations are non-existent. Further, a lack of budget plagues North Korean units the way it does Russian units. For soldiers not in special units, typically those in the capital or with ceremonial purposes, training can be altogether non-existent. Hunger is also a constant concern, with 2 or 3 potatoes per meal or raw corn kernels or corn rice making up the vast majority of meals per northern defectors. This directly results in what's been termed the shrinking North Korean army, where northern soldiers on average are several inches shorter than their southern counterparts. Training is also typically superseded by labor-intensive tasks. Soldiers are used for general labor, assisting farmers in rice paddies or in constructing roads and other infrastructure. Corruption also eats away at the North Korean military, though not at the scale of the Russian military. Corruption tends to be localized to the top leadership, with rank-and-file soldiers being made example of for committing the same acts their commanders are guilty of, and this typically means imprisonment, beatings, or death. Malnutrition is such a significant problem in the North Korean army that soldiers are regularly sent home to recover from its effects. Once they're healthy once more, they're rounded up to complete their mandatory military service. Defectors have claimed that sometimes soldiers simply starve to death during their service, though there are instances of good commanders looking after their troops and keeping them healthy, preventing this from occurring. Typically, hunger is so prevalent that soldiers have a notorious reputation for stealing anything edible that they can get their hands on, making them unpopular with local civilians. North Korea's reserve force is over 150,000 stronger than the US's, reflecting the North Korean Constitution, which enshrines every North Korean's duty to the military in law. However, reservists receive no official training upon release from the military, and it's completely unknown how realistic North Korea's ability to mobilize and arm the 600,000 reservists truly is. Given the horrible conditions inside the military, it's also unknown how many would even answer the call to mobilize, forcing North Korea to expend significant resources simply trying to gather up its reservists in the first place. By comparison, American reservists receive regular training, typically 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. U.S. reserves also regularly receive combat deployments, both to supplement the active duty force and to ensure skills and competency remain sharp. The U.S. Reserve program is a well-oiled machine, completely on its own. America's reserve force is a match for most military powers. There's one glaring exception to the state of North Korean training and readiness, and that's its vast Special Forces cadre. It's estimated that North Korea has around 200,000 Special Forces soldiers, making it the largest Special Forces in the world. By comparison, only about 3% of the entire U.S. military is designated as being a part of its most elite force. The quality of its Special Forces has some variation, but overall these soldiers have shown a high degree of proficiency and training, taking part in ongoing infiltrations and operations against the South since the late 1960s. They have also been observed carrying very modern equipment which would not be found anywhere else in the North Korean military, including night and thermal vision equipment, armored vests, and other pieces of sophisticated kit. North Korean Special Forces are broken down into various roles. Its most elite soldiers are known as Lightning Commandos, and they're meant to directly counter American Navy SEALs and South Korean Navy Special Warfare Flotilla operatives. These are the elite of the elite, and are primarily tasked with foiling American and South Korean Special Forces operations against the North Korean military and the civilian leadership itself. Airborne commandos utilize Antonov An-2 planes with the task of infiltrating the South in case of hostilities. While the Antonov An-2 is antiquated, it has the advantage of being slightly more difficult to track on radar than a modern plane due to its material construction, and the plane excels on taking off and landing on very rough runways, perfect for a quick infiltration into the South. While all North Korean Special Forces are designed to create a second front in the enemy's rear, the airborne component is specifically suited to that task, quickly infiltrating past the front line to cause general chaos in the rear areas. The light infantry component of North Korean Special Forces is unique for its lack of any heavy equipment whatsoever. True to its role, this force is meant to infiltrate into the enemy's rear through concealed movement and then target lines of communication and high-value targets, such as air defense equipment, command and control nodes, etc. To accomplish this, they can carry only light arms and anti-tank weapons. It's even believed that they don't carry any actual body armor, instead wearing Kevlar vests akin to the second chance vests many police officers around the world utilize. Maritime SOF are designed to infiltrate South Korea's coastline and launch attacks against vulnerable rear area military and civilian targets. It's believed that North Korea can deliver as many as 7,000 commandos to South Korea beaches through the use of a vast fleet of midget submarines and 24 Romeo-class diesel-electric submarines specifically designed to deliver commandos onto enemy beaches. The rugged coastline of South Korea makes it very difficult to counter these submarines, and it's believed that in just one lift, the North could deliver 5,000 of these operators into the South. Reconnaissance brigades, also known as sniper brigades, are the type you're likely to be the most familiar with. These elite operators are tasked with gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, but are also trained in direct action missions. They're meant to destroy or seize strategic targets from South Korean or American forces, and it's these operators who carry out assassination missions in the region. North Korea's Air Force numbers at just shy of 1,000 aircraft, the vast majority of which are hopelessly antiquated. The nation still operates the MiG-17, MiG-19, MiG-21, and MiG-23 fighters, with a few MiG-29s. They may also have a small number of MiG-25s, though this is hotly debated. The nation's most numerous fighter is the MiG-21, an obsolete yet still capable platform. However, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that the North Korean Air Force could not prevail against U.S. forces due to, quote, overwhelming advantages in power projection, strategic air superiority, and precision-guided standoff strike capability. The USDIA also stated that the North would have a significant difficulty operating against the South's air defense capability. North Korea does have one of the densest air defense systems in the world, given America's overwhelming use of air power. However, the bulk of its air defenses are made up of Cold War-era SA-5 Gammon and domestically produced Hwanghae-5 SAMs. During Desert Storm, Iraq had one of the best air defense systems in the world, and it was systematically dismantled by Allied air power. In conflict against America, North Korea's even older and less capable air defense network would be easy prey to superior U.S. technology and tactics. The use of stealthy F-22s, F-35s, B-2s, and soon the B-21 would further reduce the effectiveness of North Korea's defenses. The North's army operates 6,645 tanks versus America's 5,500, minus 31 or so recently sent off to Ukraine. According to South Korean intelligence, the North's tank fleet is primarily made up of obsolete T-34s, T-54s, T-55s, T-62s, and Chinese Type 59s. There's also considerable doubt as to the readiness of the North's armored forces. Given the significant age of most of its inventory, it's doubtful many of them are even in an operational state today. Domestically made Chonma-ho tanks are believed to be a copy of the Soviet T-62, with similar capabilities, while the Pokpong-ho, its most recent addition, appears to be an attempt to replicate the Soviet T-72. North Korea's tank forces are not seen as a credible threat by either the US or the South, with the bulk of its forces, even if operational, being easy prey even to ROK or US infantry fighting vehicles. North Korea knows it has never been able to match the US and the South militarily, though, which is why it's invested in asymmetrical threats like cyber warfare, special forces, and nuclear weapons to deter or win a potential war before the US can fully enter the conflict. Where North Korea does shine, and partly as a reflection of this strategy, is in its artillery force. Previously, we've called artillery-heavy armies insurance for dumb militaries when comparing the composition of the Russian military versus NATO ones. The adage holds true: the Russian military is absolutely awful at its job, but with truly overwhelming amounts of artillery, Russia has managed to level the playing field against a military a fraction of the size of its own. Despite the adoption of precision-guided munitions and a few other innovations, artillery largely remains unchanged since World War II. It's all about shooting high explosives from really far away as fast as possible. Thus, artillery can be the great equalizer for a dumb military. Thus, North Korea employs nearly 13,000 pieces of artillery versus the US's 4,400. Despite being the most powerful military in the world, the US operates a shockingly small artillery force, and that's because of its doctrine of utilizing precision air power for the role. Yet the staggering amount of artillery operated by North Korea presents a significant challenge of its own, and the South trains extensively in utilizing aircraft and counter-battery fire to destroy Northern artillery. With the South's capital, Seoul, being well within range of a large amount of the North's artillery, North Korea's trump card has always been the ability to level significant portions of the city with concentrated artillery fire in the opening hours of hostilities. Good intelligence on the North Korean Navy and its capabilities is shockingly difficult to verify, given the extreme lengths the North has gone to keep its Navy out of the limelight. It's known that the North's Navy is a green water navy, or a coastal force with little capability to project power far from its own shores. It's also mostly made up of submarines, meant to blockade southern ports in case of a war, or deliver huge amounts of infiltrating special forces through the use of a mini armada of midget submarines. North Korea's submarine fleet is designed specifically to complicate US military response and hold southern shipping at risk, and despite being largely made up of obsolete Cold War-era boats like the Whiskey, Romeo, Yugo, and Hungnam-class subs, they can be surprisingly difficult to locate when powered down and lurking in ambush. Nearly all North Korean submarines, even its smaller Yono class, which are designed to infiltrate small groups of special forces, have the capability of laying mines, further complicating the naval environment around the peninsula. A growing arsenal of long-range missiles could give the North subs the ability to threaten both land and sea targets, though it's unknown just how effective these attacks would be against modern air defenses. North Korea also operates 2 light frigates of the Najin class, with one being modernized in 2014, and a small fleet of corvettes armed with anti-ship missiles. It also operates a small fleet of missile and torpedo boats, meant to quickly strike targets before disengaging. The most recent acquisition is the Nongo-class stealth missile boat, a catamaran-style design with some stealthy characteristics to reduce its radar signature. Against an American fleet of 484 ships, including 11 supercarriers, 9 amphibious assault carriers, 68 submarines, 92 destroyers, and 22 corvettes, the North's Navy has no chance. But it wasn't designed to win a stand-up fight. Rather, the North's main focus is to inflict a high cost on any responding American naval forces or on those of the South itself. Just how effective it would be at doing this is in serious doubt, though, given the US's vast ISR capabilities and long-range targeting. The only credible threat the North has is its fleet of 35 diesel-electric submarines, which can lurk in ambush on battery power and can be very difficult to identify in shallow waters. North Korea's greatest weapon is its growing arsenal of nuclear bombs. It's believed that the North has around 100 nuclear weapons in its arsenal today and has test-fired missiles which place the entire continental United States under threat. However, its arsenal of long-range missiles is likely extremely limited and not sufficient to overcome the U.S.'s ballistic missile defenses, both in theater, across the Pacific, and on the homeland itself. The real threat of the North's nuclear arsenal is a short-range attack against the South or even Japan, with fears that the North could infiltrate portable nuclear weapons into the South's major harbors and detonate them in place, significantly slowing down America's ability to transport forces from across the Pacific into South Korea and causing massive civilian casualties. North Korea remains completely militarily outclassed by the US and South Korea, but it's a foe that's made its own inevitable defeat even more painful than ever thanks to the arsenal of nuclear weapons and estimated 5,000 tons of chemical agents. The year was 2004 and a container ship called the Ever Unique made its last stop at the port of Newark in the US after leaving from China. On this particular day, FBI and Secret Service agents were laying in wait, believing that some containers on the ship might be carrying something of interest. They were right, but what they'd find was more than they'd bargained for. Under boxes filled with an array of plastic toys, they discovered secret compartments that contained hard cash, except the money was only $100 bills. The notes they beheld were flawless, faultless, and to anyone but an expert gifted with the right technology, these notes were just as good as the real thing. But they weren't the real thing, they were counterfeits. Almost perfect counterfeits. Where'd they come from? Who had invested the time and money to create such flawless notes? The authorities understood immediately that to make such consummate currency, you'd need very advanced technology. These were obviously by no means your run-of-the-mill counterfeit notes. The experts who looked at them couldn't believe their eyes. This was a huge problem. The US dollar, being what we call the world's currency, is very, very difficult to recreate perfectly, but someone had done it. When the authorities took these bills to forensic analysts, what those analysts saw before them was a perfect composition of fibers used in real bills. They even commented that the engravings were possibly of a better quality than those created by the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The fakes were in one sense even better than the real thing. They came up with a new name for these bills, and that was the supernote. Almost perfect imitation that would fool just about anyone, from the man in the street to the teller at the bank. Hell, if you could create enough of these things, you could spend until your heart's content and have little fear about getting caught. Since the discovery of the first super $100 bills, millions more have been found on container ships with loads destined for the US. But who is making these supernotes? Following the discovery, investigators in the US started a series of operations such as Royal Charm and Smoking Dragon, at first thinking the counterfeits were being made by powerful gangs originating in Asia. Unlike many organized crime outfits that traffic drugs and guns in the West, Asian gangs tend to work quietly and share a high degree of sophistication. But when the investigation started paying off and links to these gangs were arrested on American soil, the authorities shocked the world. They said that it wasn't the networks of organized crime that were actually making the fake money. It was the government of North Korea. The gangs, they merely spread the money around. In no time at all, North Korea denied the accusation, but the US said the evidence they had was more than sufficient. North Korea was a money-making machine, they said, and technologies the country used were second to none. What ensued was a bank in Macau called Banco Delta Asia being shut down, and with it the accounts of some of North Korea's ruling elite. The bank was accused of taking counterfeit cash and then laundering it in the world of real money. This shady kind of business was all run through something called Room 39, North Korea's Department of Dark Money. Or at least that's where all of the evidence pointed to, or what evidence was available. Was this such a big deal at the time, seeing as the world was watching in fear as their TVs told them that the secret nation was hell-bent on creating weapons that could bring us all down? The answer is yes, it was a really big deal, with some US officials calling it an act of war. You see, when counterfeiters are merely street-level hustlers doing a bad job recreating cash, or even organized crime giving it a shot, it's not seen as such a large threat. People have been counterfeiting cash for many years, since the time when you could have been hanged, drawn, and quartered for trying to fake the king's coinage. But one state doing it against another, that could be said to be a hostile act under international laws. The US came right out and said that by counterfeiting another country's currency, you are in no uncertain terms a threat to the American people. As we said, the branch of the North Korean government responsible for such criminal enterprises is known as Room 39 or Office 39 or Bureau 39, it's all the same thing. How do we know this entity exists, since North Korea isn't exactly giving tours to US officials and investigators and showing them exactly how things are run? The answer is high-ranking North Korean defectors. Some of these folks have come out and said the most unbelievable things. Word on the street is that Room 38 deals with the cash made by Room 39. Room 35, though, that's in a league of its own. That's the office that focuses on assassinations and kidnappings. There are also reports that Room 39 is behind the production of illegal drugs on an industrial scale. We're talking meth labs that would impress the fictional Walter White. The drugs can be made in North Korea under the eye of the government and then sold around the world for those American dollars the country likes so much. Since North Korea can't really make money on the international market due to sanctions, one way to make dollars is to go through the black market. Room 39, if you like, is the black market HQ for North Korea. While many folks seem to believe the majority of the world's narcotics come from South America and through Mexico, what's often underlooked and perhaps not Netflixable enough is the fact that many of the world's drugs are actually coming out of Asia. All kinds of drugs can be made in countries such as North Korea or in parts of Myanmar, and then through Asian gangs shipped around the world. Methamphetamine labs have been a great source of income for North Korea during harsh international sanctions. But ice isn't the only order of the day. It's reported that the country also has many poppy fields and has for a long time. The raw opium is then turned into heroin, and that heroin finds its way into Asian countries and subsequently to North America and Europe. If the country wasn't so closed off, we might have seen a Narcos North Korea show. Experts writing about the country tell us that the meth production began not as a money spinner, but as a way to keep North Korean soldiers alert and awake. No surprise there isn't a military in the world that hasn't given its troops some kind of speed at one time or another. In the 90s, the country hit a wall when there was a very bad opium crop harvest, and North Korea saw dope profits fall drastically. Officials who were hit hard by this put their heads together and said, why not start using state facilities and start making methamphetamine and trafficking it abroad? Meth isn't ever prey to a bad harvest, and the officials agreed to knock up some labs under state-owned companies and then get in touch with various Asian criminal networks in China, Myanmar, and Thailand. Think about it. If North Korea can produce the best banknotes that forensic analysts have ever seen, what kind of meth could the country make? Perhaps Kim Jong-un and his cronies are breaking bad on a scale that would literally blow our minds. But North Korea isn't immune to its own drug problems. One expert said recently that the government has cracked down on meth production since the country now faces a meth epidemic. It isn't that the government was selling it to its own people, but that some North Korean citizens created their own labs. Private enterprises were creating the meth and then paying bribes to state officials so they could keep producing. Those officials were paying other officials, and in the end everyone turned a blind eye and got paid. If the bribe wasn't paid, as happened in 2019 when a woman was given a prison sentence of 10 to 15 years, you went straight to jail. The donju, which means the elites or masters of money, will get paid by these private drug dealers and traffickers. If there's a crackdown, according to some sources in North Korea, any donju doing deals with the public will be notified before the bust. If that sounds confusing to you, what some inside media tells us is that the government isn't happy about the average citizen getting in on the drugs business, and so they are being taken out. However, if they're connected and pay their way in bribes, officials are happy to look the other way. So who pushes North Korea's dope? The answer might surprise you. Scores of trade officials and North Korean diplomats have been arrested for trying to sell NK-made medicinal amphetamines and benzodiazepines worth millions of dollars abroad. This kind of thing goes back many years, and each time the North Korean government has said the diplomats went rogue and they weren't giving the profits back to the powers that be. No one really believed this, of course. One defector said in 2018 that Room 39 was about one thing and one thing only, and that is to supply the great leader of the country and his cronies with money. He called the money raised a revolutionary fund. He said that some of the exports controlled by this room are in fact legal, but of the $639 million to $2.5 billion made each year, a lot of the income is from illicit activities. This has been called a royal slush fund, and if you don't know what a slush fund is, it's what you might call dark money earned by corrupt means. He said he worked for the Kumgang Trading Company, which dealt in gold, gemstones, and ginseng. Because there are sanctions on North Korea, part of his job was to smuggle the products across the border into China, and from there it would reach the international market. And that's hardly the crime of the century, but defectors have also said another product being smuggled out of the country is weapons. Those weapons might make their way to organized crime or countries devastated by internal conflict. North Korean weapons have ended up in countries in Africa, South America, and the Middle East. And there's another type of crime North Korea engages in that might surprise you. Insurance fraud hasn't been talked about very much in the media. North Korea's Room 39 is said to have raked in hundreds of millions of dollars from international companies working as reinsurers, which means offering protection for insurance companies. North Korea has denied it, but investigators have said the country has made fraudulent claims on a helicopter crash, 2 train crashes, and a ferry sinking. Other dubious claims have been related to crop failures, mining accidents, fires, and floods. The state-owned Korea National Insurance Corporation will initially take the risk, but then that's passed on to international reinsurers from various countries in the world. Reinsurers in Europe, India, and Egypt were all involved in the payout for that helicopter crash, which some investigators say was staged. An expert who spoke some years after the crash said one lesson had been learned, and that was never agree to have disputes decided in a North Korean court, and never reinsure KNIC. So if the North Korean people are starving, where does all the money go? Well, a lot of the cash coming out of Room 39 goes toward the military and the country's nuclear program. Most of it fills the pockets of the country's leaders, and very little goes to the people who need it most, North Korea's citizens. A lot goes to the super rich of North Korea, like when the Italian government blocked the sale of 2 luxury yachts to North Korea in 2009. Room 39 was behind the purchase, and the boats were worth more than $15 million. Reports have also surfaced that through this office, North Korea has illegally imported hundreds of luxury cars, vans, and other vehicles. As a report stated in 2010, criminal proceeds are distributed to members of the North Korean elite, including senior officers of the armed forces, and are used to support Kim Jong-il's personal lifestyle and are invested in its military apparatus. But for a country most considered technologically backwards, North Korea has another criminal surprise waiting for you. Reports in 2019 stated that North Korea's hackers stole around $2 billion from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges in 17 different countries. Hacking might have become the country's newest and most profitable way of making money, and all without the risk of being stopped by customs officials and having their product confiscated. By now, it's sure that North Korea has made far more than the $2 billion originally stated, making hacking extremely lucrative for North Korean cyber whizzes. What'll come out of Room 39 next, we do not know. But we expect more nefarious cyber activity to be in the cards. North Korea has tried a lot of things, including the illegal export of fake Marlboro cigarettes and its very own version of Viagra, but it's likely that the hacking game will be the way ahead as long as there are sanctions on the country. As for the meth and the opiates, there will always be a market for that as long as North Korea can keep getting it through the large border with China. As one defector put it, the only way to earn hard currency is by drugs. But time has proven him wrong, and now North Korea's criminal enterprise exists in both the real and cyber world. Still, don't be surprised if some of the drugs on the streets in the USA and elsewhere start coming with the label proudly made in North Korea. This is the story of betrayal, abuse, and becoming a movie star in the most oppressive country in the world. Every year, thousands of people defect from North Korea to the surrounding countries. But what's it like for a US soldier to defect to North Korea? One man fully embraced his new overlords and did some terrible, terrible things. This man's name was James Joseph Dresnok, and he not only committed the insane crime of defecting to North Korea, but while there, he became the go-to enforcer for disciplining other United States soldiers. Dresnok's story is a dark one, with some crazy twists and turns. You might be wondering why a US soldier would do crazy things like defecting to North Korea. The answer may not be what you imagine. James Joseph Dresnok had a rough childhood. His parents got divorced when he was 10, and he never saw his mother again. He lived with his father for a bit, but then was placed in a foster home, dropped out of high school, and joined the army, who sent him to West Germany. He had married before being deployed, but when he returned home from his tour, he found that his wife had left him. Dresnok decided to re-enlist and was sent to South Korea. At this point, things weren't getting any better for Dresnok. He had no family, no wife, and nothing to lose. Soon after being stationed in South Korea, Dresnok found himself facing court-martial charges for forging signatures on paperwork that would allow him to leave the US base. But rather than facing punishment, Dresnok had other plans. On August 15, 1962, Dresnok waited for the soldiers on the base to head to lunch before making his move. He snuck off the base and crossed the minefield that separated North and South Korea in broad daylight. Dresnok had no intention of being court-martialed. The North Korean soldiers on the other side of the DMZ weren't exactly welcoming at first. To be fair, they probably didn't trust any Americans, even if they were defecting. Dresnok was taken to Pyongyang, where he was interrogated. Many years later, Dresnok recounted this defection and explained why he did it. He said, "I was fed up with my childhood, my marriage, my military life, everything. I was finished. There was only one place to go. That place was North Korea. And once he was there, things got really crazy." Soon after entering the country, Dresnok met another United States soldier who had defected to North Korea named Larry Allen Abshir. A few few other U.S. soldiers would join them later on, but unlike the others, Dresnok seemed to eventually fully embrace his new home. One of the main jobs that defectors had in North Korea was acting in the film industry. That might seem unbelievable, but the U.S. soldiers did not just play any role, they were always the villains. In North Korean films, the bad guys are almost always Americans, because in reality, every North Korean movie is propaganda. Some of the movies that the defectors starred in were even directed by Kim Jong-il himself. The leadership seized the opportunity to use U.S. defectors in their films to further ingrain the hatred of the enemy in the citizens of the country. However, this also led to Dresnok becoming a movie star. It was his role in a film called Unsung Heroes, where he played an American villain named Arthur Cockstud, that gained him fame in North Korea. After the film aired, people on the streets of Pyongyang would affectionately call him Arthur after his character in the movie. His character's name became more commonly used than his actual name. But it wasn't just the life of an actor that Dresnok lived. He had other responsibilities as well. He would appear on magazine covers and use the loudspeaker on the border of the DMZ to try to persuade more U.S. troops to defect to North Korea, where life was much better. It was not all fun and games, though. It was reported that all of the U.S. soldiers who defected tried to seek asylum at the Soviet embassy, but were turned away and immediately given back to the North Korean authorities. This would suggest that Dresnok and the other defectors were not completely happy with their decision to live in North Korea. Dresnok was recruited by Kim Jong-il himself to help translate American movies into North Korean subtitles so that he could watch them. The American also taught English at the college level and translated writings for North Korean leaders, so it would seem Dresnok was a man of many trades, but all were for the benefit of the North Korean government. Helping and entertaining North Korean leaders were the more mild things that Dresnok did. There was also a much darker side to the life of this defector. Charles Jenkins was one of the other defectors in North Korea with Dresnok. He had crossed the demilitarized zone with an empty M14 during one of his patrols. Jenkins stated he had defected because of his fear of being sent to Vietnam as the war there began to escalate. Like Dresnok, Jenkins was put into propaganda films. He even played a character named Dr. Kelton alongside Dresnok in Unsung Heroes. In the film, Jenkins was an evil U.S. businessman who was trying to keep America at war so he can make massive amounts of money off his arms manufacturing business. This was propaganda against the United States and capitalism as a whole. Jenkins' head was shaved and his face was covered with makeup to make him look as villainous as possible. He was forced to appear in other films as well as translate American movies for Kim Jong-il's cinema addiction. But Jenkins got extremely lucky when he married a Japanese woman who had been kidnapped by North Korea and was living there against her will. She was used to teach North Korean spies the Japanese language. In 2004, Japan and North Korea made an agreement that released many Japanese kidnapping victims back to their homeland. Jenkins was sent to Japan with his wife, where he wrote the book The Reluctant Communist: My Desertion, Court-Martial, and 40-Year Imprisonment in North Korea. In it, Jenkins recounts the darker side of James Joseph Dresnok. What he did will make your stomach churn. Dresnok was a bully who would do the bidding of North Korean leaders no matter what the task was. He would often betray the other U.S. soldiers who had defected by telling the North Koreans everything they said, especially if it pertained to escaping or going against their oppressors. But even that wasn't the worst part. Dresnok would also beat up the other U.S. soldiers. He became the go-to punisher for the North Koreans when they needed to instill fear in other Americans. Dresnok denied the allegations when Jenkins' book came out, but of all the defectors, Dresnok seemed to embrace his North Korean home more than the others. This wasn't surprising, as he may have received special treatment for his willingness to cooperate and accept his new rulers. In one of his North Korean propaganda speeches, Dresnok said that during the North Korean famine in the 1990s, he would receive plenty of food even as North Korean citizens all starved around him. Of course, in his message, he blamed the United States and Japanese sanctions for causing so much death and starvation in the country. He ended his speech by stating, "The great leader has given us special solicitude. The government is going to take care of me until my dying day." Whether Dresnok was willing to say these things of his own free will or was forced by the North Korean government, it's unclear. However, it would not be the last time he would praise North Korean leaders. During his time in North Korea, Dresnok was married twice. Each marriage was under questionable circumstances. His first wife was Donia Bombea, who was from Romania. In official North Korean records, it was stated that Bombea worked in the Romanian embassy in Pyongyang, but her family claims that was not the case. According to Bombea's family, she was an art student in Italy when she was abducted and smuggled to North Korea. The abduction may have been a plan by the North Koreans to provide one of the U.S. deserters with a wife so that they could create a more white-looking baby for future propaganda films. When Bombea's family brought the abduction to the attention of the Romanian government, they requested an explanation from North Korea. They never received an answer. Donia Bombea was said to have died from lung cancer, but not before giving birth to 2 sons. It's not entirely clear who Dresnok's next wife was, but it may have been the daughter of a North Korean woman and a Togolese diplomat. Together, they had a son. All of Dresnok's children are still living in North Korea and have been integrated into the society. James Joseph Joseph Dresnok died of a stroke in April 2016. He was the last of the United States soldiers still alive who defected to North Korea. In 2006, he recorded an opening to a film in which he said, "I've never regretted coming to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I feel at home. I really feel at home. I wouldn't trade it for nothing." You may be wondering who the other defectors were other than James Joseph Dresnok and Charles Jenkins. Less is known about the other 4 soldiers, but some facts have recently surfaced. As we mentioned before, Charles Jenkins was the only one to get out of North Korea, but what about the others? On May 28, 1962, Private Larry Allen Abshir left his post and crossed the minefields into North Korea. He was the first U.S. soldier to defect to North Korea. Abshir had been caught smoking marijuana several times on the base, and instead of facing the consequences, decided to defect. Once in North Korea, like all the other defectors, he was put into the propaganda films. Just after Dresnok defected, a man named Jerry Wayne Parrish crossed the DMZ to North Korea. He was a corporal in the U.S. Army at the time and never gave a clear reason for defecting other than if he returned home, his father-in-law would kill him. Roy Chung defected to North Korea sometime around 1979, but his story is stranger than the others. Chung was stationed in Germany when he disappeared from his unit. However, 3 months after the disappearance, the North Korean government announced over a radio broadcast that the U.S. soldier had defected. He was now happily situated in their country. Chung's parents couldn't believe their son would defect and insisted that he was kidnapped by the North Korean government. In 1982, Private Joseph T. White was the last U.S. soldier known to have defected to North Korea. He seemed to have somewhat of a plan. He shot the lock off a gate at the demilitarized zone using his M16 and then shouted, "I am coming," as he walked across the minefield toward North Korea. When investigators searched White's belongings in the barracks, they found pro-North Korean pamphlets and other propaganda among his stuff. Like all the defectors, White was welcomed by North Korean soldiers who had handcuffed him and shoved him into a bunker. Kim Jong-un says both the U.S. and South Korea should be thoroughly annihilated, as he claims that America and its allies have made unprecedented moves in 2023 that have pushed the Korean peninsula to the brink of war. Of course, that claim came with the qualifier that this annihilation would occur only if the U.S. and South Korea provoked Pyongyang. But the message from Kim Jong-un is clear. "I'm ready to fight, and if need be, push the nuclear button to safeguard North Korea's security." As Kim puts it, North Korea has to sharpen the treasured sword so that it's ready to stab and slice at will should the country ever go to war with the U.S. or South Korea. All of this leads to an obvious question: who would win if South Korea and North Korea locked treasured swords in 2024? To answer that question, we start with the most obvious comparison: direct military strength. For years now, North Korea has been strengthening its military to the point where it could be a severe threat to its biggest rival. And with annihilation on the horizon, the potential of war between North and South Korea is higher than it's been in decades. The news that North Korea is ready to strike, reported on January 1st, comes amidst expectations that the country is going to conduct a higher number of weapon tests in 2024 than at any other point in its history. According to Sky News, Kim seems to believe that strengthening North Korea's nuclear arsenal will give him leverage to gain concessions from the U.S. should Donald Trump be elected president again. But if we take the nukes out of the equation for a moment, we're left with a comparison of conventional military strength. Across the DMZ, North Korea's more democratic twin has also been preparing for war. According to Global Firepower, South Korea has one of the world's strongest militaries. It ranks number 6 in its list of 145 countries for pure military power, with South Korea having a power index score of 0.1505. For context, Global Firepower considers a score of 0.0000 to be perfect. North Korea isn't a slouch in military power, but it doesn't quite compare to its neighbor to the south. Global Firepower ranks it as the 34th strongest military nation in the world, with a power index score of 0.5118. That alone would suggest that South Korea would come out on top in a direct fight between the two, at least if only conventional weapons were used. However, we need to dive deeper to see how the country's military stack up against one another. We'll start with sheer manpower. Surprisingly, North Korea comes out on top when it comes to the number of active military personnel. It has 1.2 million active members compared to South Korea's 555,000, with its paramilitary forces also being stronger. They number at 200,000, with South Korea only having 75,000. Though it's worth pointing out that paramilitary forces aren't officially recognized as a part of a nation's military. Thus, they're less predictable and perhaps more prone to following their own path rather than any official orders. On the reserve front, the countries are comparable, with North Korea having 600,000 reserves to South Korea's 500,000. Still, North Korea seems to have more manpower until you remember one thing: both countries have national conscription programs. According to a South Korean general named I.B. Chun in an interview with Policy Exchange, men serve in the North Korean military for at least 11 years, with women serving for between 6 and 7. By contrast, South Korea's mandatory military service lasts for between 18 and 21 months, with the service being limited to physically fit men aged between 18 and 35. Typically, these men can also choose when they want to complete their service. Again, it seems like North Korea comes out on top because it has a longer conscription period, which may also account for why it has more active military personnel. But Global Firepower stats suggest the numbers may be misleading. It says that South Korea has nearly 26 million people who could potentially fight in its military, while North Korea has only 9.3 million and change. If war were to break out, South Korea has millions more people it could call upon, many of them already trained to fight against North Korean forces. So, there are two sides to the manpower story. North Korea has more active personnel, whereas South Korea has more available manpower should it need to strengthen its army at short notice. That latter point is demonstrated by Global Firepower, pointing out that the South has 21.2 million people who are fit for service compared to North Korea's 5.2 million. The North may have more people in its army right now, but that could change quickly if South Korea requires more manpower. It's also worth looking at each country's military budget. After all, spending affects how many soldiers a country might have, as well as the quality of their equipment. And in this department, South Korea is the clear victor. Global Firepower estimates that South Korea spends about $42 billion per year on its military, a number that's backed by Statista, though it places the estimate close to $40 billion. North Korea spends about a tenth of that, with an annual budget of $4.5 billion, though this may increase slightly in 2024. South Korea has more cash to splash, and when you compare the country's purchasing powers, nearly $2.1 trillion for South Korea compared to $38.5 billion for North Korea, it is clear the South could easily ramp up its military spending even more if needed. North Korea may not have that option, but when North Korea spends, it at least seems to be able to spend somewhat wisely, which brings us into an examination of air power, stacking the Korean People's Army's Air Force (KPAF) against the South's Republic of Korea Air Force or ROKAF throws out some interesting numbers. South comes out on top in terms of the number of aerial assets, as it has 1,602 aircraft to the North's 947. But interestingly, the North has 56 more fighter planes, perhaps suggesting it would anticipate a lot more aerial dogfighting to take place in a war with South Korea. It's with supporting aircraft that North Korea falls. It has only one transport craft compared to the South's 41, and South Korea also has aerial tankers and special mission craft that the KPAF doesn't have. Add to all that South Korea's much more impressive fleet of helicopters, 600 more than the North split between standard and attack choppers, and odds are high that the South would reign supreme in an aerial battle. But what about a fight on land? North Korea has a few victories in that department. It has 6,645 tanks compared to South Korea's 2,331, and about 2,000 more self-propelled artillery, also called locomotive artillery, that's capable of using inbuilt propulsion systems to get closer to a target before firing. North Korea also ranks third in the world for mobile rocket projectors, with 2,920 compared to 581 held by the 12th-ranked South Korea. Yet, North Korea doesn't have clear land dominance. When it comes to armored vehicles, the South is the clear victor, as it has over 133,000 compared to the North's 39,000. That matters because it means South Korea has more vehicles that are capable of getting troops into North Korea relatively safely, meaning the South is better positioned to launch a land-borne invasion. South Korea also has about 676 more towed artillery units, though the difference is negligible in comparison to the armored vehicle issue. As for terrain, both countries are covered in hills and mountains. Korea.net says that 3/4 of South Korea is mountainous, with North Korea's geography being somewhat similar. That's good news for the South. It's much easier to negotiate hilly terrain in smaller armored vehicles than it is in cumbersome and bulky tanks. South Korea has traded pure strength for enhanced agility, which may give it an edge on the ground. But how do the two countries stack up if we take the battle to the seas? According to Global Firepower, North and South Korea are pretty much equivalent when it comes to coastline coverage. The South has almost 1,500 miles of coverage compared to the North's 1,550 miles. So both would consider naval attacks in addition to having to safeguard their coasts against the other. And in that seaborne battle, North Korea finally appears to come out on top. Global Firepower says it has the third largest naval fleet in the world, with 519 vessels compared to the 157 South Korea has. North Korea also has more submarines, 35 to 22, and over 4 times the number of patrol vessels South Korea has. Where the South comes out on top is its destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, as it has more than North Korea in all of those departments. Those ships have more firepower than North Korea's patrol boats, meaning a naval battle would come down to the North's pure numbers versus the South's strength. Throw submarines into the mix, and South Korea may find that its northern rival can scupper some of the larger ships before they can make ground or be effective in deeper waters. Nevertheless, a potentially stronger navy doesn't mean that North and South Korea are evenly matched on the conventional front. Yes, the North has more vessels and more active military personnel, but South Korea comes out on top in spending, air assets, and ground units. Additionally, the personnel numbers are deceiving. North Korea may have more people actively serving in its military, but South Korea's conscription means it has more people who are fit for service and can be called upon if a war between the countries starts. If it was simply a case of South Korea versus North Korea, the South would likely win. But this fight wouldn't be so simple. Both countries have allies who may not only support them, but have a vested interest in helping their allied country maintain or expand its power. However, the nature of those two alliances differs, with some being more overt, while others have tensions hidden behind them that could render them moot in the case of a Korean War. Starting with South Korea, it just so happens to be allied with the world's strongest military nation, the United States. In July 2023, South Korea and the U.S. celebrated their 70th anniversary of working together. The Mutual Defense Treaty the two countries signed in 1953 is still in full effect, to the point where the U.S. Department of Defense can claim to have over 28,000 American troops stationed in the Korean Peninsula. That alliance is underpinned by 3 crucial words: "We go together." These words are an explicit statement of intent, meaning that the U.S. will support South Korea in its wars, just as South Korea will support the U.S. The alliance traces its creation to the Korean War. In June 1950, North Korean troops, supported by Russia and China, marched across the 38th parallel, which is the line of demarcation that separates South Korea from its northern neighbor. In response to this act of aggression, the United Nations, or UN, gathered a multinational force to support South Korea. Most members of that force were American soldiers. Over the 3 years of fighting that followed, the U.S. sent hundreds of thousands of troops to South Korea. Over 33,000 of those troops never returned home, and of those who did, 103,000 were wounded. When the war ended in July 1953, the U.S. and South Korea had an alliance forged from fighting together that was made official by the Mutual Defense Treaty the countries signed that same year that the war ended. To this day, the United States is South Korea's largest defense partner, but it's not the only partner that South Korea has. Though Japan and South Korea have long experienced roadblocks that prevented them from forging a true military relationship, those obstacles have cleared in recent years. Throughout the 2020s, South Korea has conducted trilateral military drills and training exercises with Japan and the US, meaning Seoul and Tokyo have stronger links than they've had in years. Those links are born as much out of the threat that China presents to both countries than the danger of North Korean aggressions. However, that isn't to say that Japan isn't a North Korean target. In July 2023, The Guardian reported on a North Korean ballistic missile test that saw one of its missiles crash down just 155 miles from Okushiri Island. The launch was apparently in retaliation to the threat of U.S. spy plane flights over North Korea, though Kim Jong-un might have miscalculated by targeting Japan. While he tried to display the advancements that North Korea had made in missile development, Japan obviously experienced alarm over just how close that missile had come to its territory. The bonds between the US, Japan, and South Korea strengthened as a result. Suddenly, South Korea's disputes with Japan over its past occupation of the country seemed much smaller, as did arguments over the names of stretches of water and the ownership of a handful of disputed islets. North Korea, along with China, have established themselves as mutual enemies, meaning South Korea can rely on Japan for military aid if no other reason than the fall of South Korea would endanger Japan as well. All of this is bad news for North Korea. If it went to war with South Korea, it would face additional threats from the US and Japan. On top of this, wherever the US fights, much of the Western world is likely to follow. Even if South Korea didn't receive direct military support from the West, it would likely be able to rely on money and equipment provided by countries that don't want to see North Korea expand its power. Of course, North Korea wouldn't be alone in this fight. It has alliances too, though none that could be considered as sturdy as those that South Korea shares with the US and Japan. Take its alliance with China as an example. In 1961, North Korea signed the Mutual Aid Cooperation Friendship Treaty with China, which still stands as the only cooperative treaty that China has signed with any country. In 2021, the Lowy Institute reported that the countries had renewed this treaty for another 20 years, meaning they'll be cooperating until at least 2041. And on the surface, that alliance seems strong. So strong that former Chinese leader Mao Zedong once described the two countries as being as close as lips and teeth. So North Korea would be able to rely on China for help in a war with South Korea, right? Not necessarily. Though Beijing is outwardly aligned with Pyongyang, China has a history of not cooperating with North Korea as much as North Korea would like. According to the Rand Corporation, China hasn't provided any assistance to North Korea in the development of the latter's nuclear weapons, likely fearing what North Korean aggression fueled by nukes would mean for China's influence in Asia. That wariness stretches far enough for China to offer restrained support for the UN Security Council and its sanctions against Pyongyang's nuclear weapon tests. There's clear self-interest at play here. For its part, North Korea hasn't always been a sturdy ally to China either. Kim Jong-un's execution of Jang Song-taek, Kim's own uncle, and an important contributor to the dialogue between the two countries, angered Beijing. Additionally, Rand reports that North Korean escapees often say Japan is our enemy of 100 years, China is our enemy of 1,000 years. So where America's support of South Korea appears absolute, China's support of North Korea may come with conditions. There are tensions between the countries, meaning China is unlikely to act directly on North Korea's behalf unless it is certain that the situation benefits it as much or more than it benefits North Korea. Then there's Russia. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, there's been a surge of activity between North Korea and Russia that suggests the two countries are strengthening their ties. For instance, a summit held between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin in September 2023 attracted worldwide attention, with the U.S. claiming that Pyongyang sent 1,000 containers of military equipment to Russia just days before that meeting. Furthermore, this was the fifth such shipment North Korea had sent from August 2023, with satellite images of the shipments also showing they're reciprocal in nature. North Korea sends equipment to Russia, Russia sends shipments back. But don't let those shipments fool you. There's no official alliance or treaty between Moscow and Pyongyang, with their current relationship seeming to be born out of self-interest on both sides rather than a true desire to work together. Tensions are still high, and though some commentators believe that a trilateral alliance between North Korea, China, and Russia is in the making, the IISS says it's unlikely Russia or China would support North Korea in a renewed war on the Korean Peninsula. The stakes are much higher, especially with nuclear weapons now being in the equation, and neither country would want to harm its own interests by supporting North Korean aggression. If that's the case, North Korea doesn't really have any strong allies on which it can rely. The best it could hope for would be lip service from Russia and China, combined with potential work alongside Iran-aligned militias, as reported by Stimson in October 2023. That won't be enough to overcome South Korea's allegiances. So South Korea has the edge in manpower and has much stronger alliances to call upon. It's also not likely to be the aggressor of the two nations, which works against North Korea because its aggression would make its current partners wary of a larger war. Nevertheless, there's still one advantage North Korea would bring to the fight against South Korea. Pyongyang doesn't play by the rules. According to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, North Korea is one of the only 4 countries that hasn't ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention, or CWC, created by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The only others are Egypt, South Sudan, and surprisingly Israel. South Korea has ratified the CWC and is committed to not using lethal chemical weapons in a war. As for North Korea, it won't officially say that it has chemical weapons, but according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI, there's almost no chance it doesn't have them. The NTI says North Korea started seeking out these types of weapons in 1954, 1 year after its failed invasion of South Korea, and that it developed the ability to produce them internally at some point during the 1980s. Since then, Pyongyang has focused on developing stockpiles of some of the most lethal chemical agents in the world, including phosgene, sarin, and mustard gas, along with V-type chemical agents that can cause seizures, muscle spasms, and a host of other dangerous symptoms. Just a few milligrams of this dangerous substance can be fatal to a human. The NTI also says that some North Korean defectors claim that prisoners and those with disabilities are used as test subjects for these chemical weapons. Furthermore, the assassination of Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-un's half-brother and a potential political competitor, was carried out by North Korean spies using the VX nerve agent. And that's not all. According to the NTI, a 2018 defense white paper published by South Korea claimed that North Korea had between 2,500 and 5,000 tons of chemical weapons agents, more than enough to cripple South Korea, given that just a few milligrams of one of these agents can result in death or debilitation. Of course, North Korea using these types of weapons would bring global condemnation. But if Kim Jong-un had gotten to the point where he'd declared open war on South Korea, it's unlikely he would care about other countries being upset about his use of such dangerous chemicals. And finally, there's the nuclear program. South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. Its people want them. The Wilson Center says that 71% of South Koreans support the return of nukes to their country, but Seoul hasn't built any yet. In April 2023, the BBC reported on the clandestine first meeting of an organization called the Forum for Nuclear Strategy. Made up of South Korean scientists, politicians, and military members, the forum supposedly exists to plot a course toward South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. The result for this forum's existence is obvious. North Korea is openly working toward building independent nuclear capabilities of its own. And it seems to be drawing ever closer to developing full nuclear capabilities. In September 2021, Pyongyang claimed to have successfully tested a cruise missile that hit a target 930 miles from its launch point. That announcement triggered ballistic missile tests by both North and South Korea, with both essentially proving that they could launch missiles at each other. They would just need nukes to add to those missiles. Right now, North Korea seems closer than South Korea to achieving its nuclear goals. According to the NTI, the US government believes that Pyongyang is able to produce enriched uranium and plutonium, with an estimate from 2017 stating that North Korea likely has enough of these materials to produce at least 12 nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un may talk about denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, but his actions don't align with his words. And of all the world's leaders, he seems to be the one who's willing to show so much aggression that he'd go down the nuclear route should war erupt between North and South Korea. So, who would win this fight? Do you think that South Korea's stronger conventional forces combined with its alliances would be enough to overcome the North's aggression? Or does Kim Jong-un's potential willingness to use chemical and nuclear weapons means that he has aces in the hole that would guarantee a North Korean victory? Kim Jong-un is preparing North Korea for war, and that war is going to happen sooner rather than later. That's the message delivered by 38 North, a publication from the Stimson Center that specializes in North Korean affairs, as it says that the situation in the Korean peninsula is more dangerous now than it's been at any time since 1950. The publication goes further. Like his grandfather before in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. But will North Korea really start a war in 2024? To find the answer, we need to dig into what Kim Jong-un has been saying in recent months, and more tellingly what he's been doing. Let's start with the rhetoric. On January 18, 2024, the RAND Corporation, or RAND, published an article that highlighted 2023 claims by South Korea's National Intelligence Service that North Korea was likely to start using unexpected cyber and military provocations in 2024. The news was just the latest that suggests that Kim Jong-un is gearing up for conflict, and the words coming out of the leader's mouth seem to align with the theory. Take what he said at the end of 2023 as an example. During the course of 5 days of year-end meetings with his allies, Kim claimed that the United States poses various types of military threat, wrapping up on the final day of meetings by telling his military that it needs to maintain an overwhelming war response capability. As is usually the case, Kim is placing all the blame on North Korea's enemies, though his message indicates that he believes that war could break out in the Korean peninsula at any time. While he claims an invasion would force that to happen, the greater likelihood is that he's going to be the one who starts the fight. But hold on a second. Yes, the claim that Pyongyang needs to be ready for war at any time is a serious one, but is it really much different from the claims that Kim has made before? After all, this is a man known for his constant provocations, both of the US and South Korea, and so these comments could just be more of a series of seemingly empty threats. That seems unlikely to be the case. Honing in on Kim's provocations, there's no denying that they've both grown more frequent and more dangerous over the last decade or so. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, breaks it all down into numbers. This data reveals that provocations from North Korea have increased dramatically since the presidency of George W. Bush. When Bush was in office, North Korea made an average of 3.5 provocations per year, That ramped up to 10.88 per year when Barack Obama was in office and stayed somewhat stable during Donald Trump's presidency, declining only slightly to 10.25 per year. Then Joe Biden took office and Kim Jong-un seemed to grow bolder. CSIS said the United States has recorded an average of 30.33 provocations per year since Biden was elected, around triple what they were during the previous two administrations, creating a total of 91 North Korean provocations during Biden's tenure in office. These provocations don't solely come in the form of rhetoric. CSIS says that North Korea has been ramping up its missile testing, with each test launch being a provocation, and many of its tests aren't related to experimental equipment. Kim is testing weapons that he already has to make sure that they're combat ready when the time comes. Something has changed in Kim's approach to war. According to DW, that change is linked to the abandonment of North Korea's approach to the United States. Over the last few years, Pyongyang has looked to normalize relationships with the US as best it could. However, according to DW, Kim may now believe that such normalization is impossible. It claims that many analysts are underestimating just how important this desire for normalization was in terms of Kim not turning his threats of war into action. With that guardrail removed, there's now very little stopping him from following through on all of the talk and actually launching an attack. We can trace this change of internal policy to 2019 and the Hanoi summit between Kim and then US President Donald Trump. At that time, the talk focused on North Korea winding down its weapons program in return for the US waiving some of the sanctions it had placed on Pyongyang. But 5 years later, that promise of fewer sanctions has not panned out, with Kim now supposedly believing that North Korea has two options when it comes to the US: live under the thumb of a supposed oppressor, or as DW puts it, take advantage of the supposed fact that the time is ripe for the status quo to be challenged. We can see this change of approach most clearly when we look beyond the US and check how Kim Jong-un is talking about his neighbor, South Korea. In the 2023 year-end speech that Kim gave to the North Korean people, he made several promises. Beyond outlining some of the country's military plans for 2024, he touched on inter-Korean relationships, and his tone was hostile. The conversation reports that Kim said that the relationship between the two has become a relationship between two hostile countries and two belligerents at war. The rhetoric became even more aggressive. Kim went on to say that he now believed the Republic of Korea clan to be Pyongyang's biggest enemy, calling for North Korea to continue stockpiling weapons to ensure it had the overwhelming power to defeat its southern nemesis. Forbes also has snippets of Kim's speeches in which he declares South Korea a hostile state, and most worryingly, that he would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if, quote, the enemies ignite a war. Reuters also reported that Kim told his military that it needs to be ready to pacify the entire territory of South Korea, again mentioning the use of nuclear bombs as a response to any attack the South makes. Kim making threats to South Korea isn't anything new, but the nature of these threats, especially the reclassification of South Korea as a hostile state, is something that we've not seen before. Kim is following his normal route in propaganda terms of blaming enemies of North Korea for escalating conflict. But now he's saying that those supposed escalations will be met with force, all suggesting that he's gearing up for a war in 2024. But again, you could argue that those are just words, the ramblings of a madman whose bark is far worse than his bite. The real proof that North Korea will go to war in 2024 comes from Kim's actions rather than what he says in an attempt to ensure his oppressed people stay loyal to him and his causes. Kim's actions suggest that war is practically inevitable. For all of his posturing, giving up on the concept of reunification with South Korea means that Kim has said no to any potentially peaceful resolution of the conflict that exists between them. Instead, he's looking to claim South Korea through force, and what he's doing on the military front supports that claim. Take his new satellites and drones as an example. During the previously mentioned end-of-year speech, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea will be launching 3 new satellites in 2024. The announcement comes in the wake of Pyongyang finally managing to get a spy satellite into space in November 2023, with that launch achieving success at the 3rd time of asking, following 2 failed launches. What this proves is that North Korea now has the technology to launch the satellites that Kim wants to build, and if he gets 3 more in orbit during 2024, Kim will have the ability to spy on South Korea and potentially the US in ways he hasn't been able to do before. The November launch was controversial enough. The US condemned it for being in brazen violation of UN resolutions intended to govern such launches, so Kim has shown that he doesn't care about following international laws and resolutions. Add to all of this Kim's promise to start building military drones. Again, Pyongyang could argue that this action is simply an attempt to achieve parity with the US and South Korea, both of which have access to drones. But when taken along with the rhetoric, remember, Kim is blaming provocation from the US and South Korea for these policies, the picture becomes clearer. Kim would have his people believe that the supposed provocations from North Korea's enemies are going to force his hand, with every move he makes from now until conflict begins merely being preparation so Pyongyang can defend itself. And there's much more. North Korea's missile tests have been intensifying over the last year, with the country also supposedly developing new types of missiles that would allow it to pose even a greater threat to its enemies. According to DW, 2023 saw Pyongyang launch a record number of missiles, a clear show of strength directed at South Korea, along with a rocket from November that put its satellite into space. Worse yet, Kim claims that one of the missiles it launched is an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that would allow it to hit targets much further afield than any missile it used previously. ICBMs often carry nuclear warheads. Though North Korea's testing of this type of technology isn't confirmed, a successful ICBM test would mean that Kim has the missiles he needs to drop a nuke on South Korea without his army ever having to leave the North. That is a worrying prospect, and it feeds into the nuclear rhetoric that Kim's been spouting since the end of 2023. Just as worrying are the reports coming of the country's first missile test of 2024. On January 15th, CBS reported that North Korea claimed it had conducted its first successful flight test of a solid-fuel missile equipped with a hypersonic warhead. The launch was detected by both the Japanese and South Korean militaries, with the mention of a hypersonic warhead being especially troublesome. The Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation says that anything that can travel at hypersonic speeds is capable of Mach 5 or higher, at least 5 times the speed of sound. While ballistic missiles have long been capable of hitting these types of speeds, the fact that North Korea is apparently now capable of launching Mach 5 rockets is huge. After all, the faster a missile can move, the harder it is to both detect and hit it when it's in motion. Plus, faster rockets result in less time to shoot the missile out of the sky. Regardless, the missile traveled about 621 miles before landing in the East Sea, with Japan's defense ministry stating it had reached a maximum altitude of 30 miles. It's also not the first North Korean missile to splash down in the East Sea in recent times. A Hwasong-18 ICBM fired from Pyongyang did the same on December 18, 2023. All of this amounts to Kim Jong-un showing the world that North Korea has missiles that are capable of hitting South Korea. Those missiles may not have the precise capabilities that he claims. We can rarely tell between propaganda and truth when it comes to Kim's rhetoric. But Pyongyang's rockets clearly work well enough to launch satellites and reach some of Kim's most feared enemies. With capable missiles now a part of his military, Kim's able to back something up that he's offered many times in the past: his nuclear threats. Reuters reported that North Korea hasn't tested a nuclear weapon since 2017, the same year that it was able to successfully launch an ICBM. That successful test came with typical bluster from Kim Jong-un, who directed his threats at Japan by claiming that his new missiles could sink Japan into the sea. However, nothing came of these threats. That isn't because North Korea has abandoned its nuclear program. North Korea has abandoned its that Kim has likely been slowly building up his stockpile in the years that followed the successful 2017 test. It points to data from the Institute for Science and International Study, which says that Pyongyang may have had anywhere between 31 and 96 nukes in April 2023. It may have built more in the months since, and Kim hasn't been shy about his nuclear ambitions. In 2021, he claimed that North Korea had created technology that allows it to miniaturize and lighten its standard nuclear weapons, making them easier to launch, and potentially meaning Pyongyang's ICBMs could carry their nuclear payloads even further. Plus, January 2023 brought with it clear claims from Kim that he aimed to exponentially expand North Korea's nuclear arsenal, building up to it having the ability to mass-produce tactical warheads. All extremely worrying stuff. However, concern could evolve into fear when we consider the fact that nuclear terrorists on the Korean peninsula have worsened since the beginning of 2023. Back then, Kim's claims of expansion could have been seen as posturing, like so much of what he says. But the fact that he's directly mentioned that North Korea would respond to any aggression from South Korea with a nuclear strike. Every recent missile launch has been a threat of a nuclear strike. So too has every claim about the expansion and modernization of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. It all leads to a tense situation. And it's a situation that the United States may be unintentionally feeding. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the U.S. is committed to using nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea should any country launch nukes against it. That was cause enough for tension on its own. You could argue that North Korea's entire nuclear program even emerged as a response to this indirect threat. And even though the U.S. would be unlikely to ever launch nukes unless it was a retaliatory strike, think of it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. North Korea is so threatened by the U.S. and its nukes that it developed nuclear weapons of its own, thus intensifying that threat. Tensions deepened even more when South Korea and the U.S. announced that they plan to cooperate to form a plan for nuclear weapons use. ICAN says that declaration came in April 2023, deepening the cooperation that already exists between the U.S. and South Korea as a part of their Indo-Pacific Trilateral Military Agreement, which also includes Japan, to cooperate militaristically. On the one hand, the agreement saw South Korea's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, reaffirm that his country wouldn't make any efforts to develop its own nuclear weapons despite international pressure to do so in the face of North Korea's threats. But it's also in this agreement that the U.S. confirmed that it would issue a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response to any nuclear launch by North Korea. Kim Jong-un likely took this as a direct threat. His increasingly aggressive rhetoric seems to suggest he did, along with his reframing of South Korea as a hostile nation, rather than one with which he aims to achieve reunification. Perhaps Kim sees the combined threat of South Korea and the U.S., with Japan backing them up, as so great that he'll have no choice but to push the nuclear button, regardless of what the U.S. claims it would do in response. There's also one little change in vernacular that could lend credence to the idea that Kim is more willing to use nuclear weapons. When Pyongyang launched its ICBM into the East Sea in December 2023, it called the test a launch drill. Every reference to similar launches in months and years prior have always been referred to as test firings. The switch to launch drill may seem minor, but it could confirm that Pyongyang has perfected its Hwasong-18 ICBM and is now ready to move into mass production rather than building individual rockets to see if they'll work. Only time will tell. But if we put it all together, the picture does not look pretty. Kim is making increasingly aggressive threats against his, quote, enemies, as well as putting his military on notice. He's made a direct reference to conducting nuclear strikes, with his missile tests proving he is likely capable of doing so. The launch of 3 new spy satellites in 2024 will enable him to conduct reconnaissance on South Korea in ways that he previously couldn't. Worse yet, there's more evidence that Kim is gearing up for something big. DW reports that U.S. satellites have recently tracked changes to a chemical production base called Manfo-Una Chemical Complex. The base, which is believed to be used to create the chemicals needed to fuel North Korea's missiles, as well as chemicals that go into its nuclear weapons, has been undergoing extensive expansion and modernization in recent years. 38 North has more news. It says that the satellite images, all of which come from commercial satellites, have shown increased activity at the plant since April 4, 2021, suggesting a ramping up of Kim's nuclear arsenal. This tallies with what Kim himself says, and with the Reuters article that claims that he may have nearly 100 nuclear weapons in his arsenal. The 38 North article goes on to say that the satellite imagery has tracked multiple instances of special rail cars moving between the Una base and North Korea's Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center, the place responsible for most of the country's nukes. Those rail cars are believed to carry chemical reagents, specifically nitric and sulfuric acid, that are used to convert, enrich, and process the materials used in nuclear bombs. In short, there's a clear link between a chemical plant that's being modernized and Pyongyang's chief nuclear research center. As for the modernization efforts, 38 North says that the facility now has 5 production plants, all stationed alongside a single specialized railway that runs through the facility and connects 2 others. Imagery captured in 2016 showed the implementation of several settling tanks for chemicals, though later images showed those tanks to be empty, raising questions about whether they're operational. However, most eyes should be focused on one of the facility's southern production plants. Made up of 2 large buildings, this plant has seen the addition of a pair of vertical storage tanks since 2018, along with consistent renovations and the building of the foundation of a new storage building, which looks likely to measure 12 by 90 meters. All of this activity tells us that the plant is up and running and that it's supplying chemicals to help the North Korean war effort. These are also not the only expansions occurring. On January 25th, 38 North also reported on the construction of a new wharf, this time at a petrochemical facility located in Namfo. That port is North Korea's largest, and it connects to the Taedong River to provide easy access to China and the rest of Southeast Asia. New storage tanks have been added, with 38 North suggesting that the work indicates that North Korea expects to start importing more petroleum, lubricants, and oils, all materials used in weapons, in the coming months. These are just two isolated examples of the modernization that appear to be happening in North Korea. Taken alone, they might mean little, but in the wake of Kim's nuclear threats, the expansion of the chemical plant that directly links Pyongyang's nuclear research takes on a whole new meaning. And building a new wharf in Nampo suggests that increased trade between North Korea and China is expected to take place. And that brings us to our ultimate sign that North Korea is gearing up for a war in 2024. It's strengthening its alliances. In December 2023, the South China Morning Post reported that a senior North Korean diplomat visited Beijing. The visit was notable because it was the first made to China since before the COVID-19 pandemic, with the media outlet reporting that the meeting could have been a way for China to sue North Korea as a way to put pressure on the US. That may have been the case, but it's also worth noting that the meeting could represent the defrosting of some tensions that have built between North Korea and China in recent years, especially given that China is now more open to deporting North Korean escapees. Plus, on January 25th, The Independent reported that North Korea was preparing to host a Chinese delegation led by China's vice foreign minister, again with the likely goal of strengthening bonds between Pyongyang and Beijing. An alliance like this could give Kim the confidence he needs to launch a strike against South Korea, especially if China offers its military backing. It's also not the only partnership North Korea is cultivating. On January 24th, VOA News reported that the alliance between North Korea and Russia was reaching previously unheard-of levels. It reported on Pranay Vadi, the Senior Director of Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council, who gave a chilling speech to the Center for Strategic and International Studies on January 18th. Vadi said, "What we are seeing between Russia and North Korea is an unprecedented level of cooperation in the military sphere." VOA's reports highlight that Putin turned to Kim when he needed to replenish Moscow's weapons stockpile after the Ukraine invasion took longer than Putin anticipated. Kim obliged, and in doing so, he built a bond with Russia that goes beyond mere trade. Satellite images released in October 2023 showed about 1,000 containers shipping from North Korea to Russia, all in violation of sanctions against Moscow that likely contained weapons. The New York Times reported that North Korean artillery has started to show up in Ukraine, confirming the military alliance. Kim is helping Russia in this way because he knows he'll be able to go running to Putin when he decides to start his own war. He wants to see the situation in Ukraine resolved in Russia's favor, so that he'll have another major power in his corner when he eventually decides to attack. For as much as many analysts see Kim and perhaps even North Korea as a whole a big joke, it's clear that the great successor has been gearing up for something big. He's forging alliances with the world's two strongest military powers after the United States. He has nuclear weapons and has built the missiles to launch them. North Korea is engaging in the modernization and expansion of crucial bases, and it's now able to launch spy satellites into space. All of this has been achieved amidst recent rhetoric that shows that Kim Jong-un isn't in the mood for normalization or reunification anymore. He's ready for war, and at some point in 2024 he's going to have moved all of his chess pieces into place, meaning he'll be ready to strike. North Korea isn't exactly the friendliest country in the world. It has few allies. Ever since it was formed in the aftermath of the Korean War, it's been ruled by one family and three men, all members of the Kim family, who ruled it as a hardline authoritarian communist state. The small country is known for its aggressive foreign policy, waging small-scale attacks against its neighbor South Korea, taking foreign hostages, and developing a nuclear program that it repeatedly uses to menace foreign countries, especially the United States. Even most other countries that don't have friendly relations with the US shy away from North Korea due to how unpredictable the country can be, with a few big exceptions. In recent years, China's taken a more moderate stance in terms of its economic policy. The massive country run by the Chinese Communist Party since the days of Mao Zedong opened its economy and repealed the infamous one-child policy. But there's one area where it hasn't moderated at all: foreign policy. Rather, China's actually begun to take a more aggressive posture in the region. They've expanded into the South China Sea, building artificial islands for military bases in international waters and other countries' territorial waters, and repeatedly threatened the small island nation of Taiwan Taiwan and its allies. China and North Korea have more in common than just a border, and they might be tighter than ever. Under Xi Jinping, the current leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and now essentially China's dictator for life, China's been seeking to surpass the United States as the world superpower. Most analysts say they have a long way to go before this is even a remote possibility, but China's tactics indicate they're playing the long game. This includes trying to create global alliances with countries opposed to U.S. hegemony, including outlaw nations like Iran, Russia, and yes, even North Korea. But the relationship between the two neighboring countries is complex and has been for a long time. China had close relations with the Korean government in exile during the period where Japan occupied Korea. But when communism swept through the nation, things took a very different turn. As soon as the communists began battling for control of Korea, China recognized them as the country's legitimate government. While the Korean War ended in a stalemate with two countries and a demilitarized zone, neither Korea has ever recognized the other as a legitimate government. Both recognized themselves as the rightful government of all Korea over 70 years later. But Korea might be a little more than a pawn in a much bigger game. As Korea was part of China's future plans in the 1950s, China was part of the Soviet Union, and the leaders of that massive superpower largely directed China's foreign policy in the early years. However, distance would be growing between the two, and China soon invested more heavily in Korea. Chinese forces battled US and UN-backed forces in Korea, although both sides held off on the heavier artillery to prevent the outbreak of World War III. As the war settled down, the new regime in Pyongyang, led by the first member of the Kim clan, Kim Il-sung, received heavy support from China and the Soviet Union's Eastern Bloc. But things have gotten much more complicated since. China and North Korea, as the most powerful communist countries in Asia, were natural allies. But as early as the 1960s, conflict was starting to arise. At first, it was actually North Korea that seemed to be the more conservative, with Mao's brutal policies in the Cultural Revolution being criticized. There were even brief armed clashes across the border in 1969. However, the rise of new leadership offered promise. Mao's successor reached out to Pyongyang to apologize for some of the tension, but when Deng Xiaoping took the helm in the 1980s, conflict rose again. Deng was a reformer and wanted to open China's economy, while North Korea was still staunchly communist. And no one lives forever. Kim Il-sung was a hardliner, but he was also a veteran of statecraft. While North Korea was highly repressive under him, people largely knew what to expect from the patriarch of the Kim dynasty. But he passed away in 1994 after decades in power and was replaced by the only logical successor. That would be his son, Kim Jong-il. Raised in the halls of power and taught to think of himself as the inevitable leader of the one-party state, Kim Jong-il quickly proved to be more eccentric and volatile than his father, and the buildup of tension between the two regimes wouldn't stop there. China under Deng Xiaoping and later Hu Jintao was interested in playing the long game, and that included opening trade and diplomatic relations with South Korea. That was a massive problem for North Korea and led to a brief Cold War between the two. During this period, North Korea's economy heavily declined. China wound up subsidizing trade with them to avoid a worsening famine and to avoid a mass influx of North Korean refugees at their border. When the younger Kim took over, he stepped up his country's nuclear program and would soon be taking a bigger role on the world stage. And with another change in power would come even more changes. Under Kim Jong-il, North Korea's reputation as a radical wild card increased, especially once the country got the nuclear bomb in 2006. Heavily sanctioned but defiant, North Korea leaned heavily on its few remaining allies as it maintained its insular, aggressive foreign policy. That included China, but the alliance was hardly rock solid, especially once Kim Jong-il unexpectedly died in 2011 after an illness. His replacement once again was his son, Kim Jong-un, who took office at only 29 years old. Once again raised under the North Korean system, he was seen as the most unpredictable and extreme North Korean leader yet, and China was not enthusiastic about dealing with him. While only a few years later, China and North Korea had proclaimed a year of friendship and tightened relations, in 2012, Hu Jintao met with dissident members of the North Korean leadership that planned to replace the youngest Kim with his more stable brother. One of the plotters was Kim Jong-un's uncle, who would later be executed for treason. China failed to inform Kim of the plot against his life, and he's never trusted them fully since. North Korea stepped up their aggressive foreign policy even against China, capturing Chinese fishing boats and holding them and their crew for ransom. As the nuclear program in North Korea steps up, scientists in the nation aim to build a missile that can hit anywhere in the world. China's become increasingly vocal about its differences with its radical neighbor, often seeing North Korea as a nuisance that distracts it from its largest goals. And despite that, they can't really quit being friends. Why does China put up with North Korea and maintain them as an ally, despite what are usually one-sided provocations from North Korea? Under Kim Jong-un, the Hermit Kingdom is more belligerent than ever and has even fewer allies. But despite this, China continues to maintain robust economic relations with North Korea. Many Chinese companies are sanctioned by the US for violating sanctions against North Korea. But that might be changing. By 2017, China was backing sanctions against North Korea, and North Korean state media was publicly attacking China. But under Xi Jinping, things might be reversing, with the powerful Chinese leader visiting North Korea and North Korea backing China on internationally condemned moves like the Xinjiang concentration camps and the political takeover of Hong Kong. So why do they keep coming back to each other? That might be best explained by an old-school cop movie trope. You've all seen the interrogation, the criminal is in the holding cell, and the two cops come in. One offers the suspect a cup of coffee and the other is holding a phone book ready to tune him up if he's not compliant. It's a highly effective tactic, at least in the movies, and China and North Korea might be trying to play good cop, bad cop on a global scale. North Korea, under the newest member of the Kim family, fits the role naturally, often releasing belligerent statements of nuclear annihilation for the slightest provocation. China, meanwhile, is there to calm them down and keep North Korea under control, just so long as the US keeps China happy. And like it or not, North Korea and China really can't distance themselves from each other. North Korea and China share a land border of over 1,400 kilometers, North Korea's most accessible border. The border with South Korea is marred by the massive demilitarized zone, a dangerous no-go zone for civilians, while the sea borders are highly guarded. That means the land border with China is the most convenient spot for travel and has been a popular spot for refugees. During the 1950s and the 1960s, many people flooded into North Korea from China, something that seems unthinkable now. The border from North Korea is highly guarded, but a few high-profile refugees have managed to escape to China. Same goes for trade, as the port city of Dandong on the North Korean border is where much of the trade between the two countries happens. And China has itself kept heavily invested in North Korea. Aid to North Korea makes up almost half of all Chinese foreign aid, making China North Korea's top trade partner. Without China, North Korea would likely fully descend into famine again, with no way to get basic supplies and no one to sell its goods to, which include a healthy store of metals and rare earth minerals from its mining industry. China also provides vital financial support to North Korea, although its largest bank has participated in cutting off North Korea's banks from the international banking system. So China continues to send mixed messages, joining in the international community in key sanctions while also regularly helping North Korea subvert those very same sanctions. But the bond between the two of them are a long way off from what they were during the Cold War. North Korea needs China, but China might need North Korea too. North Korea and South Korea have been a flashpoint for decades, but now a different flashpoint might be putting it out of the spotlight. The tensest spot in all of Asia at the moment is Taiwan, the prosperous island nation that gained independence during the Chinese Civil War. While mainland China was taken over by the communists, Taiwan was kept by the pro-Western military forces and in the decades since has transformed into a powerful economy and a thriving democracy. Much like in Korea, neither side recognizes the other. Taiwan's government maintains that it was the legitimate government of China, and China maintains that Taiwan is a rogue province that will be brought under its leadership by any means necessary. And the beat of war drums are getting louder. As Western nations increase diplomatic relationships with Taiwan and deepen economic cooperation while Taiwan continues to ramp up production of the world's largest factories making essential semiconductors, China becomes increasingly belligerent. They've regularly conducted war games in Taiwan's waters, bullied Taiwan's pro-Western neighbors like Japan, and made belligerent threats toward the United States should they defend Taiwan. And in a case like that, having a belligerent bad cop on a leash could be very helpful. Could North Korea join China in a war over Taiwan? No one is really able to predict this, given how insular and unpredictable the country and particularly Kim Jong-un are. However, South Korea is likely to be strongly on the side of the US and Taiwan in a regional war, and might even be tempted to join the fight. It would be strongly beneficial to China if one of the region's strongest militaries was suddenly tied up by an invasion coming from the north. While North Korea going all out and attacking Seoul might draw the US into a war to defend it, it would also divide the US focus in the region. While it's not likely China could directly order North Korea to aid it in this way, the chaos of the war might give it some influence, and there is no doubt that North Korea would love to get a chance to get revenge on its neighbors in the hated South. But China's biggest investment might actually go much further north. North Korea and South Korea is a slow-boiling conflict that's never quite ended. Taiwan is heating up but remains a Cold War at the moment. However, there is one war that's gotten very hot, and all the world is focused on it. Russia v. Ukraine has dominated the headlines for the last year, with Russia at first expected to have an easy victory. It didn't go well, and Ukraine performed an underdog run that not only made history but captivated the world and pulled in a lot of help from the Western world. Russia and China are closely aligned, with both seeking to influence the world away from U.S. influence and toward their sphere. As the war began, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin expressed their support for their partnership, and Xi seemed to approve of Putin's assault on Ukraine. But then something happened. Russia started losing badly. First, the invasion stalled when the Russian attempt to encircle Kyiv failed and Ukraine maintained control over the majority of the country. Once it became clear that this was a war and not a fast and simple conquest, Western aid started pouring into Ukraine, and Russia was hit with devastating sanctions that resembled those put on North Korea on a much larger scale. Russia found itself cut off from the global economy, desperate to get not just supplies but the weaponry it would need to keep waging its war, and it found itself with only a few allies. Russia found itself relying on weapons and military supplies from fellow outlaw nations Iran and North Korea, both of whom it saw as a proxy war between Russia and NATO, and loved the idea of weakening the US and its allies. Other pro-Russian countries like Venezuela, Syria, and Belarus had little in the way of resources to provide given their own situations. But there was one country sitting on the fence: China. Outwardly, China was all in favor of the war, making supportive comments toward Russia and even offering to negotiate a peace deal that would likely partition Ukraine. But there was one thing they would not do. China didn't participate in the sanctions against Russia and kept its economy with the country fully open. Russia could rely on China to deliver military supplies, resources, and other goods with one exception: lethal aid. China has so far refused to give Russia any weapons or get directly involved in the war in any way. And as Russia's supplies get desperately low, Vladimir Putin is getting increasingly impatient with his neighbor to the south. But despite this, Xi Jinping has stayed firm, frequently hinting that China might be about to start providing weapons to keep the US on its toes, but never actually doing it, even as Russia runs out of key supplies. And they might have an out. China's biggest reason for not providing weapons to Russia is probably self-interest. Doing so might open them up to serious secondary sanctions that could harm the Chinese economy, and they have a lot more to lose than Russia or North Korea does. China's economy is the second biggest in the world, and it does an enormous amount of trade with the countries that are currently arming the Ukrainian defenders. If it firmly gets on the side of Russia and turns this into a full proxy war, that could all come crashing down and stop decades of economic progress in its tracks. It might be worth it to create a new world order, but right now, Russia looks like a loser, and China isn't willing to risk the whole house of cards if it's not confident that Russia can finish the job even with Chinese weapons. Which is why an old frenemy might be able to give China a different route. Unlike China, North Korea has not been shy about which side it falls on in the Russia-Ukraine war. North Korea's foreign policy is based around one thing: opposing the US and its allies, and it's been a consistent, strong supplier of Russia since the start of the war. It's provided the massive country with both military supplies and deadly weapons like guns, missiles, and drones. What is the rest of the world going to do to them? Sanction them? North Korea is already under many of the same sanctions as Russia. Both North Korea and Iran have little to fear from the United States, barring a massive escalation. But China only has outsized influence on one of these countries. Is China actually influencing North Korea on what aid they're giving to Russia? It's impossible to know, but relations between the two countries have warmed in the recent years, with China largely being North Korea's lifeline to the outside world. If China wanted to coordinate its Russia strategy through North Korea, odds are that North Korea would have little choice but to listen, especially if they both came from the same place of wanting to see the US badly humbled in the biggest conflict in the world. And so North Korea might have secretly made itself indispensable. China has played a delicate game over the last few decades, especially under Xi Jinping, as it attempts to be a good cop and a bad cop at the same time. As the good cop, it seeks to expand its influence overseas through financial investments. This includes both trade deals with massive nations, thanks to its robust manufacturing sector, and heavy investments in developing nations. In Africa in particular, China is opening many factories and offering jobs to the residents. Its economy continues to grow, although there are many warning signs about troubled waters thanks to its aging population and increasing isolation politically. And that last part is largely due to the flip side of the coin. China has maintained an aggressive posture in foreign policy, and not just when it comes to Taiwan. In the South China Sea, China continues to encroach on its neighbors. It's increasingly threatening toward US-aligned neighbors and cracks down on anyone who speaks out against some of its widely condemned policy, like the Uyghur concentration camps in Xinjiang. But most of its threats are largely bluster. Its threat to shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane if she visited Taiwan on a diplomatic visit, killing the Speaker of the House at the time, would not be seen as a diplomatic incident, it would be seen as a declaration of war. And when China's bluff was called, they backed down. Which is why China might need North Korea more than ever. China and North Korea maintain a through line of trade, which could be a key way for China to provide lethal aid to Russia without actually committing to it in the eyes of the world. Shipments between China and North Korea can't be inspected without the consent of either country, and neither is about to agree. That means China could easily send weapons to North Korea, allow North Korea to send them to Russia, and maintain deniability. While this would be of a smaller scale than if China actually committed to aiding Russia militarily, it might serve China's interests. After all, China doesn't have any reason to really care about the fate of Ukraine, but it does want to keep the US and NATO tied up in Eastern Europe, sending more and more military resources and draining their stores, because China might be waiting for the right moment to make a move. Many people think China is running out of time to invade Taiwan for a lot of reasons. Its population is aging, its youth are now more willing to question the country's policies, and a full invasion with a draft could see a revolt similar to the one Putin is putting down in Russia. Additionally, while Taiwan's semiconductor facilities are the grand prize of any battle over Taiwan, TSMC is increasingly diversifying around the world, opening up new facilities in friendly countries, making it much harder for China to seize control of the industry and use it to blackmail the world. And as the war in Ukraine winds down, the US and its allies could move a large amount of their resources to defend Taiwan, a war that China could likely not win outright, which means that China might be ready to unleash the dogs. Right now, China is the most powerful country in the region, but it might not be the most feared. North Korea's increasingly belligerent rhetoric makes it a good distraction and a convenient shield for China in the event of a war. North Korea could attack troops in the region in solidarity with China, or mount a full assault on South Korea to open up a new front in the war. The only thing that is for sure is that China's outreach to North Korea in recent years isn't for neighborly reasons. It's because Xi Jinping has made a concentrated effort to cultivate North Korea as an asset. So, is a new Russia, China, North Korea axis forming? In a word, probably no. There are 3 countries along with Iran who have been cooperating. They ultimately have only one thing in common: they hate the US and want to weaken it. But that doesn't mean their interests align in other areas, particularly in the case of China, North Korea, and Russia. All 3 have territorial conflicts with each other that have even escalated to armed conflict in the past. But China is playing a high-wire act, trying to create a new world order where the opposition has equal power to the United States. But it wouldn't be an equal alliance. It would have China at the top, and that would allow China to continue expanding its sphere of influence in the South China Sea, Africa, and beyond. All it would take was a few key strategic victories, which might require the help of some allies in the region. But to get there, the unstable, volatile country of the Korean Peninsula that keeps shooting at its neighbors might be more than just strategically useful, it might be indispensable. Want to know more about what it's like to live in the most repressive country in the world? Check out regular things that are illegal in North Korea, or watch this video instead.